Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful yet profound journey through one of the most transformative figures in English history, William I, the Norman Duke who forever changed the course of a nation through conquest, blood, and iron will. From 1066 to 1087, this remarkable man, born as an illegitimate child in a Norman castle, would rise to become the architect of medieval England as we know it. Tonight's extended journey will softly explore his dramatic rise from bastard duke to conqueror king, his brutal but brilliant methods of control, and the lasting legacy he carved into the very stones of English history. Before we begin this gentle journey through medieval England, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Even if you're usually a quiet listener, don't be shy. Tell me, what fascinates you most about medieval history? Is it the castles, the battles, or perhaps the dramatic royal stories? Your thoughts always make our community warmer. And if you're new to our cozy corner of YouTube, a gentle like and subscribe helps our sleepy community grow. It truly means the world to me. So settle in comfortably, close your eyes, and let the soft echoes of Norman trumpets and the whisper of ancient castle walls carry you gently toward peaceful sleep. Tonight, we discover how one man's ambition reshaped an entire kingdom, for better and for worse. William, later known as William the Conqueror, entered this world around the year 1028 in the stone walls of Falaise Castle, deep in the heart of Normandy. His first breath was drawn not in royal chambers adorned with silks and gold, but in circumstances that would mark him for life. He was born a bastard, the illegitimate son of Duke Robert I of Normandy. The morning mist clung to the castle walls as her laver, a young woman from the town below, delivered her child. She was no noblewoman draped in fine cloth and attended by royal physicians. Instead, she was the daughter of Fulbert, a simple tanner who worked with animal hides in the narrow streets of Falaise. Some whispered she was merely a servant in the Duke's household. Others claimed she was the undertaker's daughter. But all agreed on one thing. She was not Robert's wife. Duke Robert I, known to his people as Robert the Magnificent, was a man of considerable power and ambition. The Vikings had carved out Normandy from French soil generations earlier, and Robert ruled this duchy with the fierce pride of his Norse ancestors. Yet for all his magnificence, he had produced no legitimate heir with any noble wife. His love affair with the tanner's daughter had been passionate but brief, and when little William drew his first breath, his father acknowledged the child, but could not give him the one thing that mattered most in medieval society: legitimacy. In those days, the stain of illegitimate birth followed a person like a shadow. The church taught that children born outside of holy matrimony carried their parents' sin in their very blood. Noble courts whispered behind closed doors, and rival lords would always have this weapon to use against any bastard who dared reach too high. Young William would grow up knowing that many would never see him as truly worthy of his father's title, no matter how brave, intelligent, or capable he proved to be. But Robert the Magnificent saw something special in his bastard son. Perhaps it was the way baby William's eyes seemed to hold a fierce intelligence, or maybe it was simply a father's love transcending the rigid rules of medieval society. Whatever the reason, Robert made a decision that would change the course of history. He would raise William as his heir. Legitimacy be damned. The castle of Falaise, where William spent his earliest years, was a fortress of grey stone perched on a rocky outcrop, its towers reaching toward the Norman sky like fingers grasping for heaven. From its walls, one could see for miles across the rolling countryside, watching for enemies who might come from any direction. This would be William's first lesson in the harsh realities of medieval power. constant vigilance, for danger could strike from anywhere at any time. Helena, his mother, would not remain at the castle long. Shortly after William's birth, she was married off to Herluin, the Viscount of Conteville, a political arrangement that suited Duke Robert's needs. This marriage would give William 2 half-brothers, including Odo, who would one day become Bishop of Bayeux and play a crucial role in the conquest of England. But in those early years, William learned the bitter lesson that in the world of medieval politics, even a mother's love could be sacrificed to necessity. The young boy grew up in the Duke's household, receiving the education befitting a noble son. He learned to read and write in Latin, the language of the church and of learning. He was taught the arts of war, how to handle sword and lance, how to ride a destrier into battle, how to command men and inspire loyalty. Most importantly, he learned the delicate game of medieval politics, where a single wrong move could mean death, exile, or the loss of everything one held dear. Yet always, always, there was the whisper that followed him through the castle corridors. Bastard. The word would echo in throne rooms and battlefields, a constant reminder of his questionable birth. Some of his Norman subjects would never quite accept him, and his enemies would use it as a weapon throughout his life. But perhaps this early adversity forged something unbreakable in young William's character, a determination to prove himself worthy not through birth, but through deeds. As he grew from child to boy, William displayed the fierce pride and intelligence that marked his Viking heritage. The Normans were descendants of Norsemen, those legendary sea raiders who had terrorized Europe's coast before, carving out their own territories. They brought with them a culture that valued strength, cunning, and absolute loyalty to one's lord. These were the values that shaped William's formative years. The Norman court was a place of constant political maneuvering. Great lords came and went, bringing news from across the duchy and beyond. William learned to read men's faces, to understand the subtle signals of alliance and betrayal that could mean the difference between life and death in medieval politics. He watched his father navigate these treacherous waters with skill and determination, learning lessons that would serve him well in the trials to come. But even as young William absorbed the lessons of leadership and warfare, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. His father, Duke Robert, was a man driven by deep religious conviction alongside his political ambitions. As William approached his 8th birthday, Robert began to speak more frequently of his sins and his need for absolution. The medieval mind was deeply concerned with salvation, and Robert felt the weight of his worldly deeds pressing upon his soul. In the year 1034, Duke Robert made a fateful decision that would thrust his young bastard son into the heart of a deadly struggle for power. He announced his intention to undertake a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, that holy city where Christ had walked and died. Such a journey was incredibly dangerous in the 11th century. Pilgrims faced bandits, disease, hostile territories, and the thousand hazards of medieval travel. Many who set out for the Holy Land never returned. Before departing on this perilous journey, Robert gathered his nobles and made them swear a solemn oath. Despite his illegitimate birth, young William would be recognized as heir to the Duchy of Normandy. The assembled lords, perhaps reluctantly, agreed to honor their duke's wishes. They knelt before the boy, who was not yet 10 years old, and pledged their loyalty to him as their future lord. As Duke Robert prepared to depart for Jerusalem, he looked upon his bastard son with mixture of pride and sorrow. He was leaving behind a child to rule one of Europe's most turbulent duchies, surrounded by ambitious nobles who might see opportunity in a boy's weakness. But Robert had faith in his son's strength and in the oaths his vassals had sworn. With prayers on his lips and hope in his heart, he set out for the Holy Land, never knowing that he would never again see the grey walls of Falaise Castle or embrace his remarkable bastard son. The year was 1035, and 8-year-old William was about to face trials that would have broken lesser men. But within this illegitimate child burned the fire of ambition and survival that would one day make him the most feared conqueror in Europe. The bastard of Falaise was about to become the Duke of Normandy, and his true education in power, betrayal, and survival was just beginning. The news arrived at Falaise Castle like a raven bearing tidings of doom. Duke Robert the Magnificent, William's beloved father and protector, had died far from home in the ancient city of Nicaea, still hundreds of miles from his destination of Jerusalem. The great Duke had succumbed to illness on his return journey, his dreams of absolution at the Holy Sepulchre forever unfulfilled. In that moment, 8-year-old William ceased to be simply the Duke's bastard son and became Duke William II of Normandy, inheriting a realm that seemed determined to tear itself apart. The child Duke's world changed overnight. Where once the castle had bustled with the confident energy of his father's strong rule, now whispers filled the corridors and worried faces gathered in shadowed alcoves. The great nobles of Normandy had sworn oaths to accept William as heir, but oaths sworn to a living duke carried more weight than promises made to a dead one. Medieval loyalty was often negotiable, especially when the new lord was a child born on the wrong side of the blanket. In these dangerous early days, young William found himself under the protection of his great-uncle, Archbishop Robert of Rouen. This elderly churchman became the boy's guardian and regent, using his ecclesiastical authority and political wisdom to try to maintain order in the duchy. The archbishop understood that William's legitimacy issues made him vulnerable, and he worked tirelessly to shore up support among the Norman nobility. But the medieval world was cruel to weakness, and a child duke represented the ultimate vulnerability. Within months of Robert's death, the carefully constructed stability of the duchy began to crumble. Private castles sprang up across the Norman countryside as lesser nobles decided to carve out their own domains rather than bow to a bastard boy. Ancient feuds that Robert's strong hand had suppressed burst into open warfare, and the roads became dangerous with bandits and mercenaries. The young duke's household at Falaise became an island of order in a sea of chaos. His tutors continued his education, teaching him Latin, mathematics, and the complexities of Norman law. But increasingly, these lessons competed with more practical concerns: which lords could be trusted, where the next threat might emerge, and how long their food supplies might last if the castle came under siege. William's nights were haunted by the sounds of distant fires and the screams that sometimes echoed across the countryside. Raiders struck without warning, burning villages and carrying off anything of value. The boy learned to sleep with weapons close at hand, and his dreams were filled with shadows that might contain assassins. This was his harsh introduction to the reality of medieval power, that it must constantly be defended, and that a moment's weakness could mean death or exile. The most dangerous threats came not from distant enemies, but from within William's own family circle. His kinsmen, men who shared his Norman blood, saw opportunity in the chaos. Some believed that a bastard child had no right to rule over legitimate-born nobles. Others simply wanted power for themselves and viewed the boy as an obstacle to their ambitions. The very men who should have been William's strongest supporters became his deadliest enemies. In 1037, tragedy struck the young duke's inner circle. Archbishop Robert, his great-uncle and most important protector, died suddenly. With his passing, William lost not just a guardian, but the one man whose ecclesiastical authority had given legitimacy to his rule. The boy duke was now truly alone, surrounded by ambitious nobles whose loyalty grew more questionable with each passing day. The months that followed tested William's courage and character in ways that would have broken most children. Assassination attempts became a constant threat. Poison in his food, daggers in the darkness, or arrows from the shadows. His food was tasted before he ate it, and trusted guards slept outside his chamber door. Yet somehow the boy endured, growing harder and more cautious with each narrow escape. One of his guardians, Gilbert of Brion, fell victim to the violence that racked the duchy. This brave nobleman, who had taken on the dangerous task of protecting the young duke, was murdered by his enemies, his death serving as a grim reminder that loyalty to William could be a death sentence. The boy learned to trust sparingly and to always watch for the signs of betrayal in men's faces. Another guardian, Turchetil, met an equally violent end, cut down by assassins who sought to eliminate anyone who stood between them and the young duke. Each death made William more isolated, more dependent on his own wits for survival. The castle that had once seemed so secure now felt like a trap, its stone walls unable to keep out the poison of treachery and ambition. The most terrifying incident occurred when William was sleeping in his own chamber. His guardian Osborne was murdered in that very room while the Duke slept, the assassin's blade finding its mark just feet from where the boy lay vulnerable. William awoke to find blood on his chamber floor and another protector dead. After that night, he learned to sleep lightly, one hand always reaching for a weapon. Some chroniclers tell of William's maternal uncle Walter being forced to hide the young Duke in peasant cottages, disguising the ruler of Normandy as a common farm boy to keep him safe from those who would murder him. Whether true or embellished by later storytellers, such tales reflect the desperate nature of William's early years. The Duke of one of Europe's most powerful territories was reduced to hiding like a common outlaw, dependent on the loyalty of simple farmers for his very survival. Yet through all these trials, young William was not alone. 3 boys of noble birth shared his dangers and became his closest companions. William Fitzosborne, son of the murdered guardian Osborne, grew up alongside the Duke, their friendship forged in the crucible of shared peril. Roger de Beaumont and Roger of Montgomery completed this circle of friends, young nobles whose families remained loyal despite the chaos around them. These friendships would prove crucial to William's future success. The bonds formed in those dangerous years created loyalties that would last a lifetime. When William eventually conquered England, these boyhood companions would be among his most trusted generals and administrators. They understood him in ways that others could not, having shared the terror and uncertainty of his childhood. As William grew from child to adolescent, he began to display the qualities that would make him one of history's most formidable rulers. The constant threat of death had taught him to think quickly and decisively. The betrayal of kinsmen had shown him the importance of choosing loyal subordinates carefully. The collapse of order around him had demonstrated that only strength could maintain peace and prosperity. The boy Duke learned to read men's characters with uncanny accuracy, a skill that would serve him well in the years to come. He could spot a potential traitor by the way he avoided direct eye contact, or identify a loyal supporter by the steadiness of his voice when making promises. These were lessons that no tutor could teach. They were learned through bitter experience and paid for with the blood of those who had tried to protect him. By the time William reached adolescence, he had developed the cold pragmatism that would characterize his entire reign. Sentiment was a luxury he could not afford, and mercy was often a weakness that enemies would exploit. He learned to strike first when threatened, to show no mercy to those who betrayed him, and to reward loyalty with generous gifts and positions of power. The Norman nobility, those who had survived the chaos of the minority years, began to take notice of their young duke's growing strength and determination. Here was no weak child to be manipulated or overthrown. but an emerging leader who combined the fierce pride of his Viking ancestors with the cunning intelligence needed for medieval statecraft. Some began to regret their earlier defiance, while others doubled down on their opposition, sensing that their window of opportunity was closing. As 1042 approached, William prepared to take full control of his duchy. At 14, he was no longer the vulnerable child who had cowered in peasant cottages or slept with weapons at hand. The trials of his youth had forged him into something harder and more dangerous than his enemies had anticipated. The bastard duke was about to begin his transformation into one of the most feared conquerors in European history. The stage was set for the next chapter in William's remarkable life. The boy who had survived assassination attempts, family betrayal, and political chaos was about to prove that he was every inch his father's son, and perhaps something more. The weak child was becoming a formidable young man, and Normandy would never be the same. The year 1042 marked a turning point in young William's turbulent life. At 14 years of age, he had reached the medieval age of majority and could no longer be dismissed as a mere child playing at leadership. The boy who had survived countless assassination attempts and witnessed the murder of his protectors was ready to claim his birthright through the only means that medieval society respected: blood and steel. William's first act as an adult ruler was to convene a great council of the Norman Church and a monastery near Caen. The assembled bishops and abbots listened as their young duke proclaimed a new law, known as the Truce of God. This ecclesiastical decree forbade private warfare on holy days and during sacred seasons, attempting to restore some semblance of order to the chaos that had consumed Normandy during his minority. Fighting was banned from Thursday evening to Monday morning, and during the penitential seasons of Advent and Lent, violations would result in excommunication from the church. But even as William sought to use divine authority to curb violence, he understood that only superior force would truly bring his rebellious nobles to heel. The truce of God was a noble gesture, but it would take more than priestly threats to cow men who had grown accustomed to defying ducal authority. The young duke began quietly assembling a loyal core of supporters, drawing from those families who had remained faithful during the dark years of his childhood. His closest allies remained those boyhood companions who had shared his dangers: William Fitz-Osbern, whose father had died protecting the duke; Roger de Beaumont, whose family had never wavered in their loyalty; and Roger of Montgomery, a young man whose courage and military skill complemented William's own growing reputation. These men understood their duke's character in ways that others could not, having witnessed his transformation from vulnerable child to determined young leader. William also enjoyed the crucial support of King Henry I of France, his feudal overlord. Henry had his own reasons for supporting the young duke. A strong Normandy under a grateful leader was preferable to a weak duchy controlled by potentially hostile nobles. The French king had watched William's struggles with interest, and he approved of what he saw. Here was a young man who understood the harsh realities of medieval politics and who possessed the ruthlessness necessary to impose order on chaos. By 1046, it became clear that the simmering tensions in Normandy would soon boil over into open conflict. The noble families of Lower Normandy, led by Guy of Burgundy, had grown tired of waiting for the young duke to prove himself weak enough to overthrow. Guy was William's own cousin, a man who felt that his legitimate birth gave him a better claim to ducal authority than any bastard, no matter how determined or capable. The rebellion began with whispered meetings in castle halls and coded messages carried by seemingly innocent travelers. Guy had assembled an impressive coalition of disgruntled nobles, each nursing their own grievances against William's rule. Some resented taking orders from a bastard. Others wanted greater independence for their own territories, and still others simply saw an opportunity to advance their own power through successful rebellion. William learned of the conspiracy through his network of spies and informants, men and women who had remained loyal despite the obvious dangers of supporting him. The young Duke faced a crucial decision. He could wait for his enemies to strike first, hoping to defeat them defensively, or he could take the initiative and force a confrontation on his own terms. True to his emerging character, William chose to strike first. In the winter of 1046, as snow blanketed the Norman countryside, William sent urgent messages to King Henry of France, requesting military assistance against his rebellious vassals. Henry's response was swift and decisive. He would march to William's aid with a substantial French army. The young Duke had chosen his allies well, and now their loyalty would be tested in the crucible of battle. The opposing armies met at a place called Valles Dunes, southeast of Caen, on a cold morning in 1047. As dawn broke over the Norman countryside, two forces prepared for a battle that would determine the future of the duchy. On one side stood the rebels under Guy of Burgundy, confident in their numbers and convinced of their cause. On the other side, William and King Henry commanded a mixed force of loyal Normans and French soldiers, united in their determination to crush this challenge to legitimate authority. The battle began with the thunderous sound of charging cavalry, mail-clad knights spurring their destriers forward with lances couched and battle cries on their lips. The Norman way of war was direct and brutal, heavy cavalry smashing into enemy formations, followed by disciplined infantry to exploit any breaks in the line. William, despite his youth, showed natural talent for battlefield command, positioning his forces to maximum advantage and timing his attacks with precision. For young William, this was more than just another medieval battle. It was his trial by combat, his chance to prove that he possessed the warrior spirit expected of a Norman duke. The chroniclers record that he fought with exceptional bravery, leading charges personally and inspiring his men through his own example. Here was no pampered noble fighting from a safe distance, but a young leader willing to risk his life alongside his followers. The battle raged throughout the morning, neither side able to gain decisive advantage. Medieval combat was exhausting work, fighting in heavy armor under the hot sun, swinging sword and axe until muscles screamed in protest. Men fell on both sides, their blood turning the winter ground into a muddy, crimson paste. But gradually, the superior discipline and motivation of William's forces began to tell. The turning point came when a group of rebel knights, seeing their cause faltering, attempted to flee the battlefield. Their departure created a gap in the rebel line that William was quick to exploit. Leading a final decisive charge, the young duke smashed through the enemy formation, scattering the remaining rebels and securing victory for the loyalist cause. Guy of Burgundy managed to escape the carnage, fleeing to his stronghold at Brionne, where he prepared for a siege. But his noble allies had seen enough. The young bastard duke had proven himself in battle, and further resistance seemed both futile and dangerous. One by one, the rebel lords submitted to William's authority, seeking terms that would allow them to retain their lands and lives. The victory at Valles Dunes transformed William's position dramatically. No longer could his nobles dismiss him as a weak child unworthy of command. He had proven himself in the most fundamental way that medieval society recognized, through victory in battle. The 19-year-old duke had shown that he possessed not only courage, but also the tactical intelligence necessary for military leadership. But William understood that winning a single battle was not enough to secure lasting peace. Guy of Burgundy still held the fortress of Brionne, and from there he could rally fresh support for his cause. The young duke decided to teach his rebellious cousin a lesson that would discourage others from following his example. Brion would be besieged, until Guy surrendered unconditionally. Medieval siege warfare was a test of patience and resources as much as military skill. William surrounded Brion with his forces, cutting off all supplies and communications. No food could enter, no messages could leave, and no relief could reach the beleaguered garrison. The Duke settled in for what he knew would be a long campaign, demonstrating the methodical approach that would characterize his later conquests. For 2 years, the siege of Brion continued. Inside the fortress, conditions grew increasingly desperate as food ran low and disease spread among the trapped defenders. Guy of Burgundy watched his support crumble as his followers began to question the wisdom of continuing their hopeless resistance. Outside the walls, William waited with the patience of a hunter, knowing that time was on his side. The siege finally ended in 1049, when Guy, faced with starvation and the prospect of watching his remaining followers die, agreed to surrender. William had learned an important lesson about the effectiveness of patient, methodical warfare. Rather than risk his men in costly assaults, he had simply waited for his enemy's position to become untenable. It was a strategy he would employ again and again throughout his career. In a gesture that surprised many, William pardoned his cousin and allowed him to leave Normandy unharmed. This act of clemency was not born from weakness, but from careful calculation. By showing mercy to a defeated enemy, William demonstrated both his strength and his magnanimity. Guy's submission and subsequent departure served as an object lesson to other potential rebels. Resistance would ultimately prove futile, but surrender would be accepted gracefully. The successful conclusion of the Brion siege marked the end of the major challenges to William's authority within Normandy. The young Duke had proven himself both as a battlefield commander and as a patient strategist. His noble vassals had learned to respect his military capabilities and to fear the consequences of opposing him. The bastard child, who had once hidden in peasant cottages, was now the undisputed master of one of Europe's most formidable duchies. With internal peace restored, William could turn his attention to external threats and opportunities. The victory at Valais-Dunes had established his reputation beyond Norman borders, and neighboring rulers began to take notice of this formidable young leader. Some sought his friendship, others began to plot against him, but none could any longer dismiss him as merely the bastard duke of a minor territory. The transformation was complete. The frightened boy had become a confident young man. The vulnerable child had evolved into a dangerous adversary. William had learned the fundamental lesson of medieval politics, that power must constantly be defended, and that only strength could guarantee survival. These lessons, learned in blood on the fields of Valais-Dunes and in the mud before the walls of Brion, would serve him well in the greater conquest that lay ahead. As William looked out from the walls of his restored duchy, his gaze may have turned toward the grey waters of the English Channel. Beyond those waves lay another kingdom, another crown, another opportunity to prove himself worthy of the greatness he believed was his destiny. The bastard duke had conquered Normandy. Perhaps it was time to set his sights on even greater prizes. As peace settled over Normandy following William's decisive victories, the young duke found himself in a position to consider matters beyond mere survival and military conquest. At 22 years of age, he had proven himself a formidable warrior and capable ruler. But medieval leadership required more than just martial prowess. To truly secure his dynasty and expand his influence, William needed to make a strategic marriage that would bring him powerful allies and legitimate heirs. The medieval marriage market was a complex web of political alliances, territorial ambitions, and dynastic calculations. For a ruler like William, marriage was never simply a matter of personal affection. it was perhaps the most important diplomatic tool at his disposal. The right wife could bring armies, treasury funds, and international recognition. The wrong choice could result in dangerous enemies or missed opportunities that might haunt a ruler for decades. William's attention turned toward the county of Flanders, that prosperous territory that lay between Normandy and the German Empire. Flanders was wealthy from its textile trade and strategically located on the great European trading routes. Its count, Baldwin V, was one of the most powerful nobles in northern Europe, a man whose friendship could prove invaluable and whose enmity could be devastating. Baldwin's daughter Matilda was considered one of the most desirable brides in Europe. She was young, reportedly beautiful, intelligent, and most importantly, she carried the bloodline of Charlemagne himself. Marriage to Matilda would connect William to the most prestigious royal lineage in European history, helping to offset the persistent stigma of his own illegitimate birth. For a bastard duke seeking to establish his credentials among the legitimate nobility, such a connection was almost beyond price. The chroniclers tell us that when William first saw Matilda, he was struck not only by her beauty, but by her spirit and intelligence. Unlike many noble women of the era, who were expected to be silent ornaments in their husbands' courts, Matilda possessed a keen mind and strong personality that matched William's own formidable character. Here was a woman who could be not just a wife, but a true partner in the great enterprises he envisioned for their future. But the path to this advantageous marriage was far from smooth. When William sent formal representatives to Count Baldwin requesting his daughter's hand, they encountered an unexpected obstacle. The Catholic Church, in the person of Pope Leo IX, had serious reservations about the proposed union. Church investigators had determined that William and Matilda were related within the prohibited degrees of kinship. They were distant cousins, and medieval canon law forbade marriages between relatives closer than the seventh degree. The papal prohibition was announced at the Council of Reims in October 1049, creating a diplomatic crisis for both William and Baldwin. To defy the Pope's express command would bring excommunication and the loss of legitimacy that came with being cut off from the Church. Yet to abandon this advantageous marriage would mean the loss of a crucial alliance and the continuation of William's diplomatic isolation. Medieval rulers faced such dilemmas regularly, the competing demands of political necessity and religious obligation. The Church's growing power under the Reform movement meant that papal pronouncements carried more weight than ever before. Yet the realities of statecraft often required actions that conflicted with ecclesiastical ideals. William found himself caught between his ambitions and his faith. The young duke's response to this challenge revealed both his determination and his political sophistication. Rather than openly defying the Pope, he chose to proceed with the marriage while working behind the scenes to secure papal approval after the fact. It was a calculated risk. If he could present the Church with a successful marriage that brought stability and prosperity to his realm, perhaps the Pope could be persuaded to grant retroactive dispensation. The marriage ceremony took place in the early 1050s, probably around 1053, in the cathedral at Rouen. It was a magnificent affair, designed to display William's wealth and power to the assembled nobility. The bride arrived in a procession of carriages accompanied by Flemish nobles, while the groom waited in his finest robes surrounded by the great lords of Normandy. The cathedral bells rang out across the city as the young couple exchanged vows, binding together two of Northern Europe's most important territories. From the beginning, the marriage proved to be both a personal success and a political triumph. William and Matilda developed a relationship of genuine affection and mutual respect, rare in an age when most noble marriages were purely tactical arrangements. The new Duchess proved herself a capable administrator and trusted advisor. managing Norman affairs during her husband's frequent military campaigns, and offering counsel that William clearly valued. The couple's first child, a son they named Robert, was born around 1054. The arrival of a legitimate heir was cause for great celebration throughout the duchy. Here was proof that God had blessed the union despite the church's initial opposition. More children followed in rapid succession: William Rufus, Henry, and Adela, among others. Each birth strengthened the dynasty and provided additional security for Norman succession. Meanwhile, William continued his diplomatic campaign to secure papal approval for his marriage. He made generous donations to various monasteries and churches, demonstrating his piety and commitment to the faith despite his defiance of papal authority. He also dispatched skilled negotiators to Rome, men who could present his case in the most favorable terms possible. The negotiations bore fruit when Pope Nicholas II finally granted dispensation for the marriage, recognizing it as valid in the eyes of the Church. This papal approval removed the stigma of excommunication and legitimized William's union with Matilda. As penance for their initial disobedience, the couple was required to found 2 monasteries in Caen, one for men under William's patronage and one for women under Matilda's. These foundations, the Abbaye aux Hommes and the Abbaye aux Dames, became lasting monuments to their marriage and their devotion. The political benefits of the Flemish alliance soon became apparent. Count Baldwin provided military support during William's conflicts with the French king and other hostile neighbours. Flemish merchants brought increased trade and prosperity to Norman ports. Most importantly, the marriage elevated William's status among European nobility. He was no longer merely a bastard duke, but the husband of Charlemagne's descendant and the ally of one of Europe's most powerful counts. Matilda proved herself an invaluable partner in more than just diplomatic terms. When William was absent on campaign, she served as regent of Normandy, making decisions and maintaining order with skill that impressed even her husband's critics. Her intelligence and political acumen complemented William's own abilities perfectly, creating a partnership that strengthened Norman governance considerably. The Duchess also played a crucial role in cultural and artistic patronage. Under her influence, the Norman court became a centre of learning and artistic achievement. Scholars, poets, and craftsmen found welcome at her table, and their works helped spread Norman cultural influence throughout Northern Europe. The famous Bayeux tapestry, that masterpiece of medieval art chronicling William's conquest of England, was almost certainly commissioned under her direction. As the years passed, William's marriage to Matilda became one of the most successful royal unions of the medieval period. Unlike many of his contemporaries, William appears to have been faithful to his wife, showing none of the casual adultery that characterized most noble marriages of the era. Their partnership endured through decades of political challenges, military campaigns, and the enormous stresses of ruling an expanding realm. The children of this union would go on to play crucial roles in European history. Robert Curthose would inherit Normandy and lead the First Crusade. William Rufus would become King of England after his father's death. Henry would found the Plantagenet dynasty that would rule England for centuries. Adela would marry the Count of Blois and become the mother of King Stephen. Through their descendants, William and Matilda's bloodline would eventually spread throughout European royalty. But perhaps most importantly for William's immediate ambitions, his marriage to Matilda provided him with the legitimacy and international recognition necessary for his greatest enterprise. When he began planning his conquest of England, he could count on Flemish support and papal approval in large part because of the diplomatic advantages his marriage had secured. The bastard duke had become a respected member of European nobility, and that transformation made all the difference when he set his sights on the English crown. As William looked across the Channel toward England in the 1060s, he did so not as an isolated Norman adventurer, but as the husband of a Carolingian princess, the ally of the Count of Flanders, and the father of legitimate heirs. The strategic marriage that had begun with political calculation had grown into a genuine partnership that would sustain him through the greatest challenges of his career. In Matilda, William had found not just a wife, but the perfect complement to his own ambitions and abilities. In the great hall of Westminster Palace, an aging king sat upon his throne and contemplated the succession crisis that would follow his death. Edward the Confessor, King of England since 1042, had devoted his life to piety and the construction of magnificent churches, but he had failed in the most fundamental duty of medieval kingship, the production of an heir. His marriage to Edith of Wessex had remained childless, and as the 1050s progressed, it became increasingly clear that England faced an uncertain future when its saintly king should die. Edward's court buzzed with whispered conversations about succession. The most powerful man in the kingdom was undoubtedly Earl Godwin of Wessex, whose family controlled vast territories and commanded immense resources. Godwin's son Harold was a capable military commander and administrator who had already proven his worth in Welsh campaigns and domestic governance. Yet Harold's claim to the throne rested on political convenience rather than blood right, for he was no relation to the royal house of Wessex. Across the narrow waters of the English Channel, William of Normandy watched these developments with keen interest. The Norman Duke possessed a claim to the English throne that, while distant, was stronger than most realized. Edward the Confessor was William's second cousin. Both men descended from the same Norman royal line through Edward's mother, Emma of Normandy. In an age where bloodline determined legitimacy, this connection gave William a theoretical right to English succession. The relationship between Edward and William had deep roots that stretched back decades. During the long years of Danish rule under Nut and his sons, young Prince Edward had lived in exile at the Norman court, finding refuge among his mother's kinsmen. William's father, Robert the Magnificent, had provided sanctuary and support to the displaced English prince, creating bonds of obligation and gratitude that Edward had never forgotten. In 1051, these old connections suddenly became politically relevant when Earl Godwin overplayed his hand in English politics. A dispute over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury escalated into open confrontation between the king and his most powerful noble. When Godwin refused to punish the men of Dover for their violence against foreign visitors, Edward saw an opportunity to break free from the Earl's dominating influence. The crisis that followed shook the very foundations of the English kingdom. Edward demanded that Godwin and his family appear before the royal court to answer charges of treason and defiance. When they arrived with a substantial armed force, the situation teetered on the brink of civil war. But other English nobles, fearing that Godwin had grown too powerful, sided with their king. Faced with overwhelming opposition, Earl Godwin and his sons chose exile over destruction. With the Godwin family banished from England, Edward found himself freer than he had been since ascending the throne. The lands and offices previously controlled by Godwin's supporters were redistributed, often to Norman favourites who had served Edward faithfully during his years of exile. The king's court took on an increasingly Norman character, with French-speaking advisors and continental customs replacing many traditional English practices. It was during this period of Godwin ascendancy that William made his famous visit to England. The exact date remains uncertain. Some chroniclers place it in 1051. Others suggest it occurred later, but the political significance of the visit cannot be doubted. Here was the Duke of Normandy, Edward's kinsman and longtime ally, arriving at Westminster as an honoured guest of the English crown. The meeting between Edward and William took place in the great hall where English kings had held court for generations. Edward, now in his late 40s and increasingly focused on spiritual rather than temporal matters, looked upon his young Norman cousin with evident favour. William, barely 25 but already proven in warfare and statecraft, impressed the English court with his bearing and obvious capabilities. According to Norman chroniclers, it was during this visit that Edward made his momentous promise. Recognising William's blood claim and grateful for past Norman support, the English king allegedly designated his cousin as his chosen successor. The promise was said to have been made in the presence of witnesses, including several English nobles, who would later play crucial roles in the succession crisis. Whether Edward actually made such a promise remains one of history's great controversies. Norman sources insist that the designation was clear and unambiguous, while English chroniclers either ignore the supposed promise entirely or suggest that it was extracted under duress. What cannot be disputed is that William came away from England convinced that he had a legitimate claim to the throne, a conviction that would drive his actions for the next 15 years. The political landscape shifted dramatically in 1052, when Earl Godwin returned from exile with a powerful fleet and an army of supporters. The Earl had spent his banishment building alliances and gathering resources for his comeback, and when he landed on English shores, he found the kingdom ready for his return. Edward, lacking the military strength to resist, was forced to restore Godwin and his family to their former positions. Godwin's restoration marked the end of the brief Norman ascendancy in English politics. The continental advisors who had gained influence during the Earl's exile found themselves marginalized or expelled entirely. English customs and traditions reasserted themselves at court, and the king once again found himself constrained by the power of his greatest noble family. But if Edward's promise to William had indeed been made, Godwin's return did nothing to invalidate it. Medieval succession law was complex, and a king's designated heir retained his claim even when political circumstances changed. William continued to believe that he was Edward's rightful successor, and he began preparing for the day when he might need to enforce that claim through military action. The situation became even more complex in 1053, when Earl Godwin died suddenly, leaving his vast holdings and political influence to his eldest son, Harold. The new Earl of Wessex proved even more capable than his father, quickly consolidating power and extending his family's influence throughout the kingdom. Harold's success in Welsh campaigns and his skillful management of domestic affairs made him increasingly indispensable to King Edward. As the years passed, it became clear that Harold Godwinson represented the most immediate threat to William's succession plans. The Earl of Wessex commanded vast resources, enjoyed wide support among the English nobility, and possessed the military reputation necessary for successful kingship. If Edward died without clearly designating a successor, Harold would be the obvious choice of the English nobles. This was the situation in 1064 when fate delivered an unexpected opportunity into William's hands. Harold Godwinson, for reasons that remain unclear, departed England on a sea voyage that carried him across the Channel toward Norman territory. Whether he was travelling as Edward's ambassador, pursuing his own diplomatic mission, or simply undertaking a pleasure cruise, his ship was driven by storms onto the coast of Ponthieu. Count Guy of Ponthieu, a minor French noble with a reputation for seizing valuable prisoners and demanding hefty ransoms, immediately recognized the importance of his unexpected captive. Harold Godwinson was not just any English nobleman. He was the most powerful man in England after the king himself, a prize worth an enormous fortune in ransom money. Guy ordered Harold imprisoned while he contemplated how best to profit from this windfall. News of Harold's capture reached William quickly through his network of spies and allies. The Norman Duke immediately recognized the extraordinary opportunity that had fallen into his hands. Here was his greatest rival for the English throne, delivered by circumstances into Norman territory and subject to Norman justice. William sent urgent messages to Count Guy, demanding that Harold be transferred to his custody. Guy of Ponthieu found himself in a delicate position. William was his feudal superior and possessed the military power to enforce his demands. But Harold represented a potential source of vast wealth. After careful consideration, Guy chose discretion over greed, transferring his valuable prisoner to Norman custody in exchange for William's continued favour and protection. Harold's arrival at the Norman court created a sensation. Here was the famous Earl of Wessex, the man whose military prowess had subdued the Welsh and whose political skill had made him the virtual co-ruler of England. William received his captive with elaborate courtesy, treating Harold as an honoured guest rather than a prisoner. But the underlying power dynamics were unmistakable. The Norman Duke's treatment of his unexpected visitor was a masterpiece of medieval diplomacy. Harold was housed in comfortable quarters, invited to participate in court ceremonies, and included in hunting expeditions and military campaigns. William demonstrated his own prowess by leading Harold on a successful expedition against the Bretons, allowing his guest to witness Norman military capabilities firsthand. But beneath this veneer of hospitality lay a carefully constructed trap. Harold was entirely dependent on William's goodwill for his freedom and safe return to England. The Norman Duke possessed complete power over his guest's fate, and both men understood the implications of this situation. William had Harold exactly where he wanted him, grateful for courteous treatment, but utterly vulnerable to Norman demands. The culmination of Harold's visit came when William demanded that his guest swear a solemn oath regarding the English succession. According to Norman accounts, Harold was required to promise that he would support William's claim to the throne when Edward died. The oath was sworn upon holy relics, making it not just a political commitment, but a sacred vow that would damn Harold's soul if broken. The ceremony reportedly took place in the cathedral at Bayeux, with Harold kneeling before an altar containing the bones of saints, while Norman nobles served as witnesses. The English earl placed his hands upon the reliquaries and spoke the words that would forever after be used to justify Norman claims. He would support William's right to the English crown and do nothing to hinder the Norman succession. Whether Harold swore this oath willingly or under duress remains another point of historical controversy. Norman chroniclers naturally portray it as a voluntary act by a man convinced of William's rightful claim. English sources, when they mention the oath at all, suggest that it was extracted through threats and intimidation. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. Harold probably recognized that he had little choice but to comply with William's demands, while secretly planning to repudiate the oath once safely returned to England. From William's perspective, the oath served multiple purposes beyond its immediate propaganda value. It created a legal framework for his future invasion of England, allowing him to portray any military action as the rightful enforcement of a sacred promise. It also potentially split English opposition by placing Harold in an impossible position. He could either honour his oath and abandon his own ambitions, or break it and be branded as an oathbreaker and enemy of God. After securing Harold's oath, William allowed his guest to return to England with appropriate ceremony and gifts. The Earl of Wessex departed Norman territory outwardly grateful for his host's courtesy, but undoubtedly planning how to escape the trap that had been so skillfully constructed around him. The stage was now set for the great confrontation that would determine England's future. Harold's return to England marked the beginning of the final phase in the succession crisis. Edward the Confessor was clearly aging and unlikely to live much longer. When the king died, England would face a choice between Harold's practical claims and William's legal rights. The oath sworn at Bayeux had given the Norman Duke a powerful weapon in the propaganda war that would precede any military conflict. As 1065 progressed, it became increasingly clear that the long-awaited succession crisis was finally approaching. Edward's health was failing, and the kingdom held its breath waiting for the moment when the childless king would draw his last breath. When that moment came, Harold and William would discover whether oaths sworn under pressure carried more weight than armies assembled for conquest. The year 1066 dawned with an ominous sense of impending doom hanging over England like morning mist over the marshlands. King Edward the Confessor lay dying in his palace at Westminster, his saintly life drawing to its close after 24 years on the throne. As winter settled over the kingdom, courtiers whispered in palace corridors about succession, while across the narrow waters of the Channel, William of Normandy watched and waited with the patience of a hunting wolf. On January 5th, 1066, Edward breathed his last, leaving England without clear succession for the first time in over a century. The deathbed scene was attended by the kingdom's most powerful nobles, including Harold Godwinson, who had served as the king's most trusted advisor during his final years. According to English chroniclers, Edward's dying words designated Harold as his successor, a final act that seemed to resolve the succession crisis in favour of the practical choice over distant blood claims. The very next day, January 6th, Harold was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, the magnificent church that Edward had spent his life constructing. The ceremony was rushed by medieval standards, performed with almost unseemly haste that suggested either urgent necessity or guilty conscience. Harold's supporters argued that speed was essential to prevent civil war, while his enemies would later claim that the rapid coronation proved his awareness of the illegitimacy of his claim. News of Edward's death and Harold's coronation reached Normandy within days, carried by swift messengers who crossed the Channel despite winter storms. When William received confirmation of these events, his reaction was one of cold, controlled fury. According to his understanding, Harold had violated the sacred oath sworn at Bayeux, breaking his promise to support the Norman claim in favour of seizing power for himself. The oathbreaker had stolen what rightfully belonged to the Duke of Normandy, but William was too experienced a politician to act on anger alone. Before any military response could be contemplated, he needed to build support for his cause among the nobles of Europe, and most crucially, secure the blessing of the Catholic Church. Medieval warfare required moral as well as military justification, especially when attacking a fellow Christian kingdom. William began an intensive diplomatic campaign to legitimize his planned invasion. The Norman Duke's envoys travelled to Rome carrying carefully crafted arguments for their master's cause. They presented Harold as a perjurer who had violated sacred oaths, a usurper who had seized a throne that belonged to another by right of blood and previous designation. They emphasized William's kinship with Edward the Confessor and the promise allegedly made during the Norman Duke's visit to England years earlier. Pope Alexander II proved receptive to these arguments, perhaps influenced by reports of the English Church's independence from Roman authority. The Pope's decision to support William's claim was formalized by the gift of a papal banner, a sacred standard that would legitimize the Norman invasion as a holy war to enforce rightful succession and bring the English Church into proper submission to Rome. With papal approval secured, William faced the enormous challenge of organizing an invasion force capable of conquering one of Europe's wealthiest kingdoms. Normandy was prosperous and militarily formidable, but England was larger, more populous, and protected by the treacherous waters of the English Channel. No successful invasion had crossed those waters since the Danish conquest of the early 11th century. The Duke's call to arms attracted knights and adventurers from throughout northern France. Normans formed the core of his army, but they were joined by Bretons, Flemings, and French volunteers drawn by the promise of English lands and treasure. William's reputation as a successful military commander and generous lord attracted men who might otherwise have remained safely at home with their own concerns. The invasion fleet was assembled along the Norman coast, primarily at the port of Dives-sur-Mer. Contemporary estimates suggest that William gathered around 700 vessels of various sizes, from substantial transport ships capable of carrying horses and heavy equipment to smaller boats suited for troops and supplies. The logistical challenge was immense. Medieval armies required vast quantities of food, weapons, and equipment, all of which had to be transported across hostile waters. William's invasion force numbered somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 men, including approximately 2,000 to 3,000 cavalry, the heavy horse that formed the backbone of Norman military power. These mounted knights, armed with lance and sword and protected by mail armor, represented the cutting edge of medieval military technology. Their horses were specially trained war steeds capable of charging into battle while bearing the weight of armored riders. The Duke also assembled substantial numbers of infantry and archers. Norman foot soldiers were disciplined professionals, unlike the largely amateur militias that many medieval armies relied upon. Their crossbowmen and archers would provide crucial support for the cavalry charges, weakening enemy formations before the decisive mounted assault. This combined arms approach gave Norman armies significant advantages over opponents who relied too heavily on single tactical systems. But assembling the invasion force was only the first challenge. William faced the problem of timing. When could he safely risk crossing the Channel with such a large fleet? Medieval weather forecasting was primitive at best, and autumn storms could easily destroy an entire invasion armada. The Duke needed favorable winds and calm seas, conditions that might last only for a few critical days. Throughout the summer of 1066, William's army waited at Dives-sur-Mer, while unfavorable winds kept the fleet harbored. Week after week passed, with the wind blowing from the wrong direction, preventing any attempt at crossing. The delay was frustrating and expensive, as thousands of men and horses consumed supplies while accomplishing nothing. Morale began to suffer as the campaign season slipped away without action. The prolonged wait also gave Harold time to prepare England's defences. The English king assembled a substantial army and navy, positioning forces along the southern coast where any Norman invasion would most likely land. Harold's fleet patrolled the Channel approaches, ready to intercept any invasion attempt before it could reach English shores. The Anglo-Saxon military system, based on regional militias called fyrd, provided substantial manpower for defensive operations. As summer turned toward autumn, William faced mounting pressure to abandon the invasion or risk attempting a crossing in increasingly dangerous weather. Many of his advisors counseled caution, arguing that the risks were too great and the season too advanced for safe passage. But the Duke had invested too much in the enterprise to abandon it without making the attempt. Divine intervention seemed to favour William's cause when favourable winds finally arrived in late September. After months of waiting, the fleet was able to leave Dives-sur-Mer and sail along the Norman coast to Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, positioning itself for the crucial crossing. The change of wind direction was interpreted as a sign of God's approval for the righteous cause of enforcing sacred oaths and legitimate succession. Meanwhile, Harold faced a strategic nightmare when reports arrived of a second invasion threat. Harold Hardrada, the legendary King of Norway, had landed in northern England with a substantial army and was advancing inland from the Yorkshire coast. This Norwegian invasion threatened to split Harold's attention and divide his forces at the worst possible moment. The English king made a fateful decision that would have profound consequences for the Battle of Hastings. Rather than remaining in the south to guard against Norman invasion, Harold chose to march north with his army to confront the Norwegian threat first. The decision was strategically sound. Hardrada's army was already on English soil and posed an immediate danger, while William had not yet attempted his crossing. Harold's northern campaign proved brilliantly successful. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25th, the English army caught the Norwegians by surprise and achieved a complete victory. Harold Hardrada was killed along with most of his army, effectively ending the last great Viking invasion of England. Harold had proven his military capabilities and eliminated one of the two major threats to his throne. But success in the north came at a terrible cost in terms of timing and strategic position. Just 3 days after Stamford Bridge, on September 28th, William's invasion fleet finally crossed the Channel and landed at Pevensey on the Sussex coast. The Norman Duke had timed his invasion perfectly, striking while Harold's army was hundreds of miles away celebrating victory over the Norwegians. The Norman landing proceeded without opposition, catching the English completely unprepared. Harold's southern defences had been weakened by the transfer of troops northward, and those forces that remained were scattered across a wide front. William's veterans disembarked methodically, establishing a secure beachhead before advancing inland toward Hastings. Within days of landing, the Normans had constructed a wooden fortress at Hastings, providing a secure base for future operations. This rapid fortification demonstrated the professional expertise of William's army and his own understanding of siege warfare and military engineering. The wooden castle served both as a symbol of Norman determination and as a practical stronghold that could withstand English counterattacks. From his new base at Hastings, William began a campaign of systematic devastation designed to force Harold into battle. Norman raiding parties fanned out across the Sussex countryside, burning villages, seizing livestock, and collecting supplies for the invading army. This strategy served multiple purposes. It provided resources for William's forces while demonstrating his power to the local population and creating pressure for Harold to respond quickly. The devastation of Sussex also had psychological dimensions. By allowing his troops to plunder freely, William demonstrated both his confidence in ultimate victory and his determination to make the invasion profitable for his followers. The promise of English wealth had drawn many volunteers to his banner, and early success in gathering plunder helped maintain morale during the crucial early days of the campaign. News of the Norman landing reached Harold while he was still in Yorkshire, enjoying the fruits of his victory over the Norwegians. The English king now faced the nightmare scenario that every military commander dreads, fighting a second major battle with an army already exhausted from previous combat. But Harold had little choice, except to march south as quickly as possible and confront this new threat before William's position could become unassailable. The forced march from Yorkshire to Sussex was an epic feat of endurance that pushed Harold's army to its limits, covering approximately 250 miles in less than 2 weeks. While gathering additional forces along the way, the English troops demonstrated remarkable discipline and commitment to their king. But the physical cost of this rapid movement would become apparent when they finally faced the Normans in battle. As October 1066 progressed toward its climactic middle days, two of medieval Europe's most formidable armies converged on the Sussex countryside. Harold commanded the traditional English military system, based on heavily armoured infantry fighting behind the famous shield wall that had defended Anglo-Saxon England for centuries. William led the most advanced military machine of his era, combining cavalry, infantry, and archery in a tactical system that had proven successful throughout northern France. the stage was set for one of history's most decisive battles. On one side stood Harold Godwinson, the oath-breaker who had seized the throne through political maneuvering, fighting to defend his kingdom against foreign invasion. On the other side advanced William the Bastard, the legitimately designated heir according to his own understanding, come to claim his rightful inheritance through force of arms. The dark waters of the English Channel had been crossed, the die was cast, and England's fate would be determined by the collision of these two mighty armies on the field of battle. The Norman Conquest had begun, and nothing would ever be the same. Dawn broke grey and cold over the Sussex Downs on October 14, 1066, as two armies prepared for a battle that would decide the fate of kingdoms. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills like the breath of ghosts, as if the land itself sensed the momentous events about to unfold. On this ordinary Saturday in autumn, the course of English history would be changed forever by the clash of shield and sword, the thunder of charging horses, and the final fatal flight of a Norman arrow. Harold Godwinson's army had arrived at the battlefield during the night, his exhausted warriors taking position along a ridge known as Senlac Hill. Approximately 7 miles northwest of Hastings, the English king had chosen his ground well. The ridge provided a natural defensive position that would force the Normans to attack uphill, negating much of their cavalry advantage. Behind his position lay the Forest of the Weald, offering a potential escape route if the battle went badly, while before him stretched an open slope that would become a killing ground for any army foolish enough to attack directly. The English battle. Lines stretched for perhaps 400 yards along the ridge, anchored by Harold's elite housecarls, professional warriors who had served the royal family for years and whose loyalty was beyond question. These men wore mail hauberks and iron helms, and they carried the dreaded Danish war axes that could cleave through armour and horse alike. Between them stood the Fyrd, the militia levies drawn from across southern England, farmers and craftsmen who had answered their king's call, but whose military experience varied widely. At the centre of the English line flew Harold's personal banners, the Dragon of Wessex, and his own standard of the fighting man. Here the king took his position, surrounded by his brothers Gurth and Leofwine, and the cream of English nobility. Harold himself was a formidable warrior despite his 44 years, his body bearing the scars of campaigns in Wales and Ireland. His presence in the front rank would inspire his men throughout the long day of battle. The Anglo-Saxon military tradition relied on the shield wall, a tactical formation that had served English armies well for centuries. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder with their large circular shields overlapping, creating an almost impenetrable barrier of wood, iron, and leather. Behind this wall, spears and axes waited to strike at any enemy foolish enough to come within reach. When properly maintained, a shield wall could stop cavalry charges that would scatter less disciplined infantry formations. As the morning progressed, the sound of Norman trumpets echoed across the valley as William's army advanced into position. The Duke had divided his forces into 3 divisions: Bretons on the left, Normans in the centre, and French allies on the right. Each division combined cavalry, infantry, and archers in the combined arms approach that had made Norman armies so successful throughout northern Europe. William himself rode among his men, easily recognizable in his distinctive armour and bearing the papal banner that legitimized his cause. The Duke was 38 years old, at the height of his physical and intellectual powers, a veteran of numerous campaigns who had never lost a battle. His presence on the field sent a clear message to both armies. This was no raid or minor expedition, but a war of conquest that would be decided by the strongest and most determined. The Norman battle plan relied on coordinated attacks by different types of troops. Archers would begin the assault, weakening the English line with volleys of arrows. Infantry would follow, probing for weak points and keeping the defenders busy. Finally, the heavy cavalry would charge, seeking to break through wherever the English formation showed signs of weakness. It was a sophisticated tactical system that required precise timing and communication between different military arms. At approximately 9 in the morning, the battle began with a shower of Norman arrows arcing high into the October sky before plunging down into the English ranks. The crossbow bolts and arrows that darkened the morning sun were meant to disorder the shield wall and force the English to keep their heads down. But Harold's veterans were too experienced to be easily intimidated. Most missiles struck harmlessly against raised shields or flew overhead into the forest behind. Following the archery barrage, Norman infantry advanced up the slope toward the waiting English line. These were professional soldiers, well armed and experienced in battle, but they faced a nearly impossible task. Attacking uphill against a prepared defensive position held by determined defenders violated every principle of medieval warfare. The Norman foot soldiers advanced bravely, but found themselves unable to break through the overlapping shields and thrusting spears of the English formation. The first cavalry charge followed shortly after the infantry assault, as Norman knights spurred their horses up the slope with lances lowered and battle cries ringing across the battlefield. The sight of heavy cavalry in full charge was one of the most terrifying spectacles of medieval warfare. Mail-clad warriors on massive war horses, their lances aimed at enemy hearts and their faces hidden behind iron helms. But the English shield wall held firm, the horses unable to penetrate the barrier of spears and axes. Hour after hour, the pattern repeated itself with maddening regularity. Norman attacks would surge up the slope only to break against the English defensive line, like waves against a cliff. The archers achieved little against the raised shields. The infantry could make no headway against the thrusting spears, and the cavalry found their charges repeatedly frustrated by the disciplined English formation. By midday, it seemed that William's great gamble had failed. The turning point came when a rumour spread through the Norman ranks that William had been killed. In an age when armies were held together by personal loyalty to their leaders, such news could cause immediate collapse of morale and mass flight from the battlefield. Panic began to spread through the Norman left wing, and some troops actually began retreating down the slope toward their base at Hastings. Seeing his army wavering at the moment when success or failure hung in the balance, William acted with the decisive leadership that had marked his entire career. Spurring his horse forward, he pushed through the retreating troops while raising his helm so that all could see his face. "Look at me," he shouted in Norman French, his voice carrying clearly across the battlefield. "I live, and with God's help I shall yet prevail." His personal intervention stopped the panic and restored confidence to his shaken forces. But the near disaster taught William an important lesson about the nature of this particular battle. Direct frontal assaults against the English position were proving futile. Despite the superior quality and equipment of his troops, the shield wall was simply too strong to break through conventional means. The Norman Duke needed a different approach, one that would exploit English weaknesses, rather than relying solely on Norman strengths. The solution came in the form of feigned retreats, a sophisticated tactical maneuver that required exceptional discipline and coordination. Norman units would advance up the slope as if making a genuine attack, then suddenly turn and flee back down the hill as if overcome by panic. The hope was that portions of the English line would break formation to pursue what appeared to be defeated enemies, creating gaps that could be exploited by reserve forces. The first feigned retreat worked better than William could have hoped. As Norman troops fled down the slope in apparent disorder, a substantial number of English warriors abandoned their positions in the shield wall and charged in pursuit, eager to finish off what seemed like beaten enemies, but as they reached the bottom of the slope, the fleeing Normans suddenly turned and attacked their scattered pursuers. Caught in the open without the protection of their formation, many English troops were cut down before they could regain their defensive positions. More feigned retreats followed throughout the afternoon, each one drawing additional English warriors away from their strong defensive position. The discipline that had made the shield wall so effective began to work against the English as individual warriors, caught up in the excitement of apparent victory, abandoned their posts to chase fleeing enemies. Each successful feint weakened the English line and gave the Normans additional tactical options. As the afternoon wore on, the battle became increasingly desperate and bloody. Medieval combat was exhausting work, fighting in heavy armor under the autumn sun, wielding weapons that required tremendous physical strength, watching friends and enemies fall in the mud that had been churned by thousands of feet and hooves. The wounded crawled or were carried from the field, while the dead lay where they fell, their blood seeping into the English earth. The English position gradually weakened as casualties mounted, and fatigue took its toll. The shield wall, which had seemed impregnable in the morning, now showed dangerous gaps where men had fallen or abandoned their positions. Harold's brothers Gurth and Leofwine were both killed during the afternoon fighting, depriving the English king of two of his most trusted supporters and creating additional pressure points in his defensive line. As evening approached, William launched what would prove to be his final assault. This attack combined all the lessons learned during the day's fighting. Arrows aimed high to fall behind the English shields, infantry pressing forward to keep the defenders busy, and cavalry seeking to exploit any weakness in the increasingly ragged formation. The Norman forces, sensing victory within their grasp, attacked with desperate intensity. It was during this final phase of the battle that King Harold met his death, though the exact circumstances remain shrouded in controversy. The most famous account, preserved in the Bayeux tapestry, shows Harold struck in the eye by a Norman arrow before being cut down by Norman knights. Other sources describe different versions of his death, but all agree that the English king fell sometime late in the afternoon, his body surrounded by his loyal housecarls who died defending their lord. With Harold's death, the English cause was lost. Medieval armies depended on royal leadership for cohesion and morale, and news of the king's fall spread rapidly through the ranks. The shield wall, which had held firm for nearly 9 hours, finally began to crumble as men lost heart and sought safety in flight. What had been an orderly defensive formation became a rout as surviving English warriors fled toward the forest, pursued by Norman cavalry eager to complete their victory. The battle continued into the evening as Norman troops hunted down fleeing English soldiers in the gathering darkness. Many who might have survived if they had remained in formation were cut down individually as they tried to escape through the forest. The pursuit was relentless and merciless. William's men understood that this victory needed to be complete and decisive if it was to serve their master's purposes. As night fell over Senlac Hill, the battlefield lay littered with the dead and dying. Contemporary estimates suggest that thousands had perished during the day's fighting, including much of the English nobility and many of Harold's most experienced warriors. The cream of Anglo-Saxon military might lay scattered across the Sussex Downs, their blood mixing with the autumn rain that began to fall as darkness covered the scene of carnage. William himself surveyed the battlefield that evening, walking among the corpses in search of Harold's body. When the fallen king was finally identified, William ordered that he be buried with appropriate honours, despite their bitter rivalry. The Duke's treatment of his defeated enemy's remains showed both magnanimity in victory and recognition that he would now need to rule the very people he had conquered. The Battle of Hastings was over, but its consequences would echo through English history for centuries to come. The Anglo-Saxon era had ended in blood and defeat, while the Norman Age was about to begin. Harold Godwinson, the last Saxon king of England, lay dead on the field where he had fought so bravely to defend his crown and kingdom. William the Bastard had proven his claim through trial by combat, and England would never be the same. As the Norman camp celebrated their victory with wine and songs of triumph, the surviving English nobility faced an agonizing choice: submit to the foreign conqueror, or continue resistance that seemed increasingly hopeless. The battle had been decisive, but the conquest of England was far from complete. The hardest work still lay ahead for the man who would soon be known as William the Conqueror. The news of Harold's death at Hastings spread across England like wildfire through a dry forest, leaving shock and despair in its wake. The kingdom that had seemed so secure under Harold's capable leadership just weeks before now faced the terrifying prospect of foreign conquest. In villages and manor houses, monasteries and royal halls, the English people contemplated a future under Norman rule with mixture of fear, resignation, and desperate hope that somehow their ancient independence might yet be preserved. William, meanwhile, faced the complex challenge of converting battlefield victory into lasting political control. Winning a single battle, even one as decisive as Hastings, was far easier than conquering an entire kingdom. England remained largely unconquered territory, defended by numerous fortified towns, garrisoned by English troops who had not participated in the southern campaign, and populated by a people who had known no foreign master for centuries. The Norman Duke's first concern was securing his base of operations and tending to his wounded veterans. The battle had cost him dearly in terms of experienced knights and professional soldiers, men who could not easily be replaced in hostile territory. The dead were buried with appropriate ceremony, while the wounded received the best medical care that medieval knowledge could provide. William understood that maintaining morale would be crucial for the campaigns ahead. From his stronghold at Hastings, William launched a systematic campaign of intimidation and conquest designed to break English will to resist. Norman raiding parties ranged across the southeast, burning villages, seizing livestock, and demonstrating the consequences of opposing the conqueror. This strategy of deliberate terror was brutal but effective. Word of Norman ruthlessness spread faster than their armies, encouraging submission and discouraging organized resistance. The psychological impact of these raids was amplified by their systematic nature. William was not simply allowing his troops to plunder randomly, but was conducting a calculated campaign to break English morale. Towns that submitted peacefully were spared, while those that offered resistance faced complete destruction. The message was clear: cooperation would be rewarded, but defiance would be met with overwhelming force. Meanwhile, the surviving English nobility struggled to organize some form of continuing resistance. Edgar Atheling, the teenage great-nephew of Edward the Confessor, possessed the strongest hereditary claim to the throne, but he was young, inexperienced, and lacked the military resources necessary for effective leadership. The Archbishops of Canterbury and York attempted to provide moral authority for continued resistance, but their influence was limited without strong secular leadership. William's advance toward London was methodical and unstoppable. Rather than marching directly on the capital, he chose a circuitous route that allowed him to secure strategic strongpoints and gather intelligence about English defensive preparations. Dover fell quickly, providing him with a secure port for receiving reinforcements and supplies from Normandy. Canterbury surrendered without resistance, demonstrating that even the most important English ecclesiastical centre recognized the futility of continued opposition. The capture of Winchester, the ancient capital of Wessex and repository of the royal treasury, dealt a devastating blow to English hopes. The city's surrender provided William with both symbolic victory and practical resources. The gold and silver accumulated by generations of English kings would now fund his conquest. More importantly, Winchester's submission demonstrated that even the heartland of Harold's family power had accepted Norman supremacy. As William's army approached London, the remaining English leadership faced an agonizing decision. The capital's defences were formidable, and a siege might give time for resistance to organise in the northern counties that remained unconquered. But the cost of defending London would be enormous, and failure would mean the complete destruction of the city that had become the centre of English royal power. The decisive moment came when the leading English nobles, including Edgar Atheling and the archbishops, decided that further resistance was hopeless. A delegation left London to seek terms from the Norman Conqueror, effectively acknowledging his victory and legitimacy as England's new king. The surrender was both practical and pragmatic. Continued fighting would only bring more suffering without realistic hope of changing the outcome. William received the English submission at Berkhamsted, a royal manor northwest of London. The ceremony was carefully choreographed to emphasize both Norman victory and English acceptance of the new order. Edgar Atheling, the last representative of the old royal house, knelt before William and formally renounced any claim to the throne. The archbishops offered their allegiance, bringing the English church into submission to the new regime. But William was too experienced a politician to simply accept these submissions at face value. Medieval oaths of allegiance were often temporary expedients, broken as soon as circumstances changed. The Norman Duke needed more than formal ceremonies. He needed to demonstrate his power so convincingly that resistance would seem not just futile but suicidal. The approach to London became a triumphant procession as William's army advanced through countryside that had now acknowledged his authority. English nobles, who had initially fled, now returned to offer their submission, hoping to preserve their lands and positions under the new regime. The Norman Duke received these overtures with calculated magnanimity, accepting homage from former enemies while making it clear that any future betrayal would be met with merciless punishment. On Christmas Day, 1066, exactly 2 months after Hastings, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The choice of date was carefully calculated. Christmas was the most important feast of the Christian calendar, and holding the coronation on this sacred day would emphasize the divine approval that supposedly blessed William's cause. The location was equally significant, as Westminster Abbey was the church where Edward the Confessor lay buried and where Harold had received his own crown just 11 months earlier. The coronation ceremony itself was a masterpiece of political theatre designed to legitimize Norman rule while respecting English traditions. Eldred, Archbishop of York, performed the service using the ancient Anglo-Saxon ritual, emphasizing continuity with the past rather than revolutionary change. The crown placed on William's head was the same one that had adorned Edward the Confessor, symbolically connecting the new king to his predecessor's legacy. But the ceremony was also marked by an incident that revealed the underlying tensions of the conquest. When the assembled congregation was asked to acclaim their new king, the shouts of approval from both Norman and English voices were so loud that Norman guards outside the abbey thought a riot had broken out. Fearing treachery, they began setting fire to nearby buildings, creating panic that disrupted the sacred ceremony and reminded everyone of the military foundation underlying William's authority. William's reaction to this chaos demonstrated the iron self-control that had served him throughout his career. Despite the disruption and obvious danger, he continued with the ceremony until it was properly completed. The new King of England would not allow his coronation to be shortened or compromised by the fears and mistakes of his subordinates. This composure in crisis impressed both supporters and potential enemies, showing that William possessed the temperament necessary for successful kingship. The immediate aftermath of the coronation saw William moving quickly to consolidate his control over the mechanisms of English government. Rather than simply destroying existing institutions, he chose to adapt them to Norman purposes, demonstrating the political sophistication that would characterize his entire reign. English administrative systems that had taken centuries to develop were too valuable to discard, but they needed to be modified to serve Norman interests. One of William's first acts as king was to begin the systematic replacement of English nobles with Norman supporters. This process was gradual rather than revolutionary. English lords who demonstrated loyalty might retain their lands, while those who resisted or fled were dispossessed in favor of Norman knights who had earned William's favor through military service. The result was a fundamental transformation of English society that proceeded beneath a veneer of legal continuity. The redistribution of land served multiple purposes beyond simply rewarding William's followers. By granting estates to Norman nobles, the new king created a vested interest in maintaining the conquest among the very men whose military support he needed to defend his throne. These new landholders became the backbone of Norman rule, providing both local administration and military service when rebellions threatened royal authority. William also moved quickly to secure England's borders and strategic strongpoints through an ambitious castle-building program. These fortifications served as both military bases and symbols of Norman power, their stone walls rising above English towns like permanent reminders of conquest. The Tower of London, begun shortly after the coronation, became the most visible symbol of Norman dominance, its massive walls designed to overawe any Londoner who might contemplate resistance. The early months of 1067 saw William establishing the administrative framework that would govern Norman England for generations to come. He appointed loyal Norman barons to key positions, created new administrative districts under Norman control, and began the complex process of adapting English law to Norman preferences. The result was a hybrid system that combined English efficiency with Norman authoritarianism. But even as William consolidated his control over southern England, storm clouds were gathering in the north. The counties beyond the Humber had not participated in the Hastings campaign and remained largely unconquered territory where English nobles might organize resistance. The Scots, traditional enemies of English power, watched developments with interest and began offering sanctuary to English refugees who might prove useful in future conflicts. In March 1067, William made a crucial decision that demonstrated both his confidence in his conquest and his understanding of the political importance of maintaining connections with Normandy. He returned to his duchy for several months, leaving England in the hands of his half-brother Odo and his trusted supporter, William Fitzosborne. This journey was part victory celebration, part political necessity. The Duke needed to secure Norman affairs and demonstrate to European courts that his English conquest was permanent and successful. The regency of Odo and Fitzosborne proved effective in maintaining order during William's absence, but it also revealed the limitations of Norman control. Both regents were capable administrators and experienced military commanders, but they lacked William's personal authority and political sophistication. Their rule was more directly authoritarian than William's, creating resentments that would fuel future rebellions. William's return to England in December 1067 was prompted by reports of growing unrest in the northern and western counties. The honeymoon period following Hastings was clearly over, and the new king faced the prospect of serious challenges to his authority. The easy phase of the conquest, when shock and demoralization had paralyzed English resistance, was ending. The hard work of imposing permanent Norman rule was about to begin. The year 1068 would bring a series of rebellions that tested William's resolve and military capabilities. English nobles who had initially submitted began to reconsider their positions as they realized the full implications of Norman rule. The promise of continuity under new management was proving illusory as Norman settlers arrived in increasing numbers and English customs gave way to continental practices. But William had anticipated these challenges and was prepared to meet them with the same combination of political sophistication and military ruthlessness that had served him so well in Normandy. The coronation in Westminster Abbey had been just the beginning. The real test of Norman rule was about to unfold across the length and breadth of England. The bastard duke who had crossed the Channel with dreams of conquest had become William I, King of England, but his crown rested on foundations of blood and iron that would need constant maintenance. The Christmas coronation of 1066 marked not the end of the Norman Conquest, but the beginning of a long and often brutal process of imposing foreign rule on a proud and ancient kingdom. The year 1069 dawned with ominous signs of growing rebellion against Norman rule, spreading across the northern reaches of England like storm clouds gathering before a tempest. 3 years had passed since Hastings, 3 years during which William had worked tirelessly to establish his authority over his conquered kingdom. But the northern counties remained restive and dangerous, their loyalty grudging at best, and their hatred of foreign rule burning like banked coals ready to burst into flame. The troubles began in Northumbria, that wild and independent region that had always been the most difficult part of England for any king to control. The Northumbrians had their own proud traditions, their own fierce independence, and their own deep resentment of southern authority, whether Anglo-Saxon or Norman. They spoke with accents that southerners could barely understand, followed customs that seemed strange even to other Englishmen, and nursed grievances that stretched back generations. William's attempts to govern Northumbria through appointed officials had met with consistent failure and violence. His first appointee, a Norman named Robert Cumin, had arrived in Durham with a substantial army only to be ambushed and slaughtered, along with most of his men. The massacre sent shockwaves through Norman England and demonstrated that the northern counties would not accept foreign rule without fierce resistance. The death of Robert Cumin was followed by a series of local uprisings that William had managed to suppress through military force and political maneuvering. But each temporary victory only seemed to breed fresh resentment and more determined resistance. The Northumbrians had tasted Norman blood and found it to their liking. They knew that foreign conquerors could be killed like any other men. The situation became far more dangerous when Edgar Atheling, the last surviving male heir of the old English royal house, emerged from exile in Scotland with the backing of King Malcolm III. Edgar represented everything that Norman rule was not: legitimate Anglo-Saxon bloodline, traditional English customs, and the promise of restoration for the old order that so many English nobles secretly yearned to see returned. Malcolm of Scotland had his own reasons for supporting English resistance to Norman rule. A strong, unified England under capable Norman leadership posed a much greater threat to Scottish independence than the divided, war-torn kingdom that had existed during the succession crisis. By supporting Edgar and encouraging English rebellions, Malcolm hoped to keep his southern neighbours weak and divided, while perhaps gaining territory and tribute for himself. The crisis reached its peak in September 1069, when a massive Danish fleet appeared off the Yorkshire coast, carrying an invasion force that promised to transform local rebellions into a war of national liberation. The Danes were led by King Svein Estrithson and his sons, including the future King Snut IV. men who claimed inheritance rights to the English throne through their descent from earlier Danish rulers of England. The arrival of the Danish fleet created exactly the situation that William had most feared, a combination of foreign invasion and domestic rebellion that threatened to undo everything he had accomplished since Hastings. The Danes brought not only substantial military forces, but also the promise of ongoing support for any English nobles willing to join their cause. Suddenly, rebellion seemed not hopeless, but potentially victorious. The Danish-English alliance achieved immediate and dramatic success when they captured York, the most important city in northern England and the traditional centre of Northumbrian power. The Norman garrison was overwhelmed and slaughtered, while the city's population enthusiastically welcomed what they saw as their liberation from foreign oppression. York's fall sent panic through Norman England and encouraged rebellions in other parts of the kingdom. William's response to these disasters revealed both his strategic brilliance and his capacity for calculated ruthlessness that would define the remainder of his reign. Rather than immediately marching north to confront the Danish-English alliance, he first secured his base by crushing rebellions in other parts of England. Uprisings in the southwest were suppressed with methodical efficiency, while potential rebels elsewhere received clear demonstrations of the consequences of opposing royal authority. The king also moved quickly to neutralize the Danish threat through diplomatic means, rather than relying solely on military force. Secret negotiations were opened with the Danish leaders, offering them substantial payments in return for withdrawing from England. This approach demonstrated William's understanding that hired allies could often be bought off more easily than they could be defeated in battle. While these negotiations proceeded, William used the winter months of 1069 to 70 to assemble the largest army he had commanded since the invasion itself. Norman knights were recalled from across England and Normandy, while foreign mercenaries were hired to supplement royal forces. The king was preparing for a campaign that would settle the northern question once and for all, regardless of the cost in blood and treasure. But William's most fateful decision during this crisis was his choice of strategy for dealing with northern resistance. Traditional medieval warfare focused on capturing strongholds and defeating enemy armies, but the king had learned that such conventional approaches were inadequate for dealing with popular rebellions supported by difficult terrain and hostile populations. The north required a different solution, one that would make future resistance impossible by destroying the very foundations of organized opposition. The campaign that followed, known to history as the Harrying of the North, began in earnest after Christmas 1069, when William led his army out of York into the winter landscape of Yorkshire. But this was no ordinary military expedition seeking battle with enemy forces. Instead, William had ordered a systematic campaign of destruction designed to render the northern counties incapable of supporting rebellion for generations to come. The king's orders were clear and merciless. Everything that could support human life was to be destroyed. Crops were burned in their fields, livestock was slaughtered, farming tools were broken, mills were dismantled, and food stores were scattered to the winds. Villages were put to the torch, their inhabitants driven out into the winter cold with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The goal was not conquest, but elimination. The north would be rendered uninhabitable. Norman forces spread across Yorkshire and neighbouring counties like a plague of locusts, leaving devastation in their wake that chroniclers would compare to biblical apocalypse. The systematic nature of the destruction was perhaps its most terrifying aspect. This was not the random violence of undisciplined soldiers, but the calculated brutality of a policy designed to break an entire region's capacity for resistance. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of horror that shocked even the violence-hardened medieval world. Orderic Vitalis, a Norman chronicler who generally supported William's cause, wrote that the king cut down many people and destroyed homes and land. Nowhere else had he shown such cruelty. The monk's horror at his patron's actions speaks volumes about the extraordinary nature of the campaign. Families were separated as people fled the advancing Norman forces, many never to be reunited. Children became orphans overnight when their parents were killed or died of exposure. The elderly and infirm, unable to flee, were left to die in their burning homes. Those who managed to escape faced starvation and disease in refugee camps that sprang up in Scotland and other areas beyond Norman reach. The winter of 1069-70 was particularly severe, making the suffering even more acute. People who might have survived if they had adequate shelter and food supplies instead froze to death in makeshift shelters, or died of diseases that thrived in the unsanitary conditions of refugee settlements. The combination of human cruelty and natural harshness created a humanitarian catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. Reports of cannibalism began to emerge as desperate people turned to the ultimate taboo in their struggle to survive. Families that had managed to stay together were torn apart as parents made impossible choices about which children might be saved and which would have to be abandoned. The social fabric that had held northern communities together for centuries was shredded beyond repair. The Danish allies, horrified by the scale of destruction they had helped unleash, began negotiating seriously for their withdrawal from England. The campaign they had joined to support English liberation had become something far darker and more terrible than anything they had anticipated. King Svein accepted William's generous payment and led his forces back to Denmark, leaving their English allies to face Norman vengeance alone. By spring 1070, the harrying was largely complete, and William could survey a landscape transformed beyond recognition. Where once prosperous farms and thriving villages had dotted the Yorkshire countryside, now only blackened ruins and abandoned fields remained. The population that had supported Edgar Etheling's rebellion was dead, scattered, or broken beyond any capacity for further resistance. The long-term consequences of the harrying extended far beyond the immediate military objectives. When the Domesday Book was compiled 16 years later, vast areas of Yorkshire were still recorded as waste, uninhabited and unproductive. The region's recovery would take generations, and some areas never fully regained their pre-conquest prosperity. The demographic catastrophe fundamentally altered the character of northern England. Modern historians estimate that the death toll from the harrying reached into the hundreds of thousands, making it one of the deadliest campaigns in medieval European history. Some scholars have characterized it as genocide, though others argue that William's goal was territorial control rather than ethnic elimination. Regardless of the debate over terminology, the human cost was staggering by any measure. The campaign also had profound psychological effects that extended throughout England. The message was clear to all who might contemplate resistance. This was the fate that awaited anyone who opposed Norman rule. The king, who had shown relative moderation in the south, was capable of unprecedented brutality when his authority was seriously challenged. Fear became one of the most powerful weapons in the Norman arsenal. Edgar Etheling, seeing his support base literally destroyed before his eyes, fled once again to Scotland, where King Malcolm offered him sanctuary. The young prince would continue to be a thorn in William's side for years to come, but never again would he be able to mobilize the kind of popular support that had made the 1069 rebellion so dangerous. The North had learned its lesson in blood and fire. The harrying of the North stands as perhaps the darkest chapter in William's reign, demonstrating the lengths to which he was prepared to go to maintain his conquest. The systematic destruction of an entire region revealed a side of his character that was utterly ruthless and calculating, capable of ordering suffering on a massive scale to achieve political objectives. Yet, from William's perspective, the the campaign achieved its strategic goals completely. Never again would the northern counties pose a serious threat to Norman rule. The region that had been the heart of English resistance was broken so thoroughly that it would take generations to recover. The conquest that had begun at Hastings was finally secured through methods that shocked even medieval sensibilities. As the smoke cleared over the devastated landscape of Yorkshire, William could claim that his kingdom was finally secure. But the price of that security had been paid in the blood and suffering of thousands of innocent people whose only crime had been loyalty to their traditional rulers. The conqueror had indeed built his kingdom on blood, and nowhere was that foundation more evident than in the charred ruins of the English north. With the northern rebellions crushed and England's capacity for organized resistance broken, William could finally turn his attention to the systematic transformation of his conquered kingdom. The years following the harrying of the north marked a fundamental reorganization of English society, as the Norman king imposed new systems of government, law, and social organization that would reshape the character of England for centuries to come. The most visible symbol of Norman dominance was the massive castle building program that William initiated across the length and breadth of his new kingdom. These were not the romantic fairy tale castles of later centuries, but grimly functional fortresses designed to overawe and control potentially hostile populations. The Tower of London, begun shortly after the conquest, rose like a stone giant beside the Thames, its massive walls proclaiming Norman power to anyone who might contemplate resistance. Castle construction served multiple purposes in William's grand strategy for controlling England. Each fortress provided a secure base for Norman forces, allowing small garrisons to dominate large areas of countryside. The castles also served as administrative centres where Norman officials could collect taxes, dispense justice, and coordinate royal policy. Most importantly, they were psychological weapons that constantly reminded the English people of their subjugation to foreign masters. The design of Norman castles reflected the military realities of occupation and control. Unlike English fortifications, which had traditionally been communal refuges where local populations could shelter during times of danger, Norman castles were built to keep the English out rather than protect them. High walls, narrow gates, and commanding positions all emphasized the separation between Norman rulers and English subjects. Within these stone fortresses, a new ruling class established itself with all the confidence of conquerors who intended to stay permanently. Norman barons, rewarded with confiscated English estates, built households that combined military readiness with aristocratic luxury. Their halls echoed with French conversation and continental customs, while English servants learned to navigate the complex etiquette of Norman court life. The transformation of English nobility was perhaps the most dramatic aspect of William's reorganization. In a single generation, the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy that had ruled England for centuries was virtually eliminated. Some English nobles died in battle, others fled into exile, and still others were gradually dispossessed through legal maneuvers that transferred their lands to Norman supporters. By 1086, less than 5% of English land remained in Anglo-Saxon hands. This wholesale replacement of the English ruling class was not merely punitive, but strategic. William understood that lasting conquest required more than military occupation. It demanded the creation of a new elite whose interests were permanently aligned with Norman rule. The Norman barons who received English estates had everything to gain from maintaining the conquest, and everything to lose if it failed. The feudal system that William imposed on England was more systematic and centralized than anything the Anglo-Saxons had known. Under this new arrangement, all land belonged ultimately to the king, who granted portions to his followers in exchange for military service and political loyalty. These tenants-in-chief, as they became known, were required to provide specified numbers of knights for royal campaigns and to attend the king's court when summoned. This feudal hierarchy created a pyramid of obligation and loyalty that theoretically ensured the king's control over every acre of English soil. Each level of the system, from the king down to the humblest peasant, had clearly defined rights and responsibilities that were enforced through both custom and royal power. The result was a more tightly controlled society than England had ever experienced. The Norman approach to law and justice reflected their determination to maintain order through superior organization and royal authority. English legal traditions, which had emphasized local customs and community consensus, gave way to a more centralized system based on royal commands and Norman precedents. The king's courts gradually expanded their jurisdiction at the expense of local assemblies, creating uniform legal standards across the kingdom. Language became one of the most visible markers of the new social order. Norman French displaced English as the language of government, law, and aristocratic society. Official documents were written in Latin or French, while English survived primarily as the tongue of peasants and servants. This linguistic divide created a cultural barrier between rulers and ruled that would persist for centuries. The English Church, which had maintained significant independence under Anglo-Saxon rule, found itself brought firmly under royal control and continental influence. William replaced English bishops and abbots with Norman clerics who owed their positions to royal favour rather than local support. These new church leaders introduced continental monastic reforms and architectural styles that transformed the character of English religious life. The economic transformation of England was equally dramatic. Norman administration was more efficient and systematic than its Anglo-Saxon predecessor, leading to increased royal revenues and more effective exploitation of agricultural resources. New methods of taxation and estate management maximized the productivity of conquered lands, providing William with the wealth necessary to maintain his elaborate system of control. Trade patterns shifted as England became more closely integrated with continental markets. Norman merchants and artisans established themselves in English towns, bringing new skills and commercial connections that boosted urban prosperity. The increased security provided by Norman rule encouraged long-distance trade, while standardized weights, measures, and coinage facilitated commercial transactions. The social consequences of Norman rule extended far beyond the replacement of English nobles with Norman barons. The entire fabric of English society was rewoven according to continental patterns that emphasized hierarchy, discipline, and submission to authority. Traditional English freedoms and local autonomy gave way to a more regimented system where every person's place was clearly defined and rigidly maintained. For the English peasantry, Norman Conquest brought mixed consequences. While they remained at the bottom of the social hierarchy, the increased efficiency of Norman administration sometimes resulted in better protection and more reliable justice. However, these benefits came at the cost of increased taxation and stricter control over movement and economic activity. English women found their legal status significantly diminished under Norman rule. Anglo-Saxon law had granted women considerable rights regarding property ownership and legal proceedings, but Norman customs were more restrictive. The new system emphasized male authority and reduced women's independence in both private and public spheres. The cultural impact of Norman rule was profound and lasting. English art and architecture were transformed by continental influences, with massive Norman churches and castles replacing the more modest Anglo-Saxon structures. The distinctive rounded arches and thick walls of Norman Romanesque architecture came to symbolize the new order throughout England. Literature and learning also reflected the cultural conquest that accompanied military victory. Anglo-Saxon literary traditions were displaced by French romances and Latin scholarship. The great libraries of English monasteries were restocked with continental manuscripts, while English scribes learned to copy texts in foreign scripts and languages. The process of Normanization was gradual but inexorable. Each generation of English people grew up more familiar with Norman customs and French language, until the old Anglo-Saxon ways became dim memories, preserved only in isolated communities and ancient texts. The conquest that had begun with military victory was completed through cultural transformation. Yet, the Norman transformation of England was not entirely one-sided. The conquerors themselves were gradually changed by their new environment, adopting English administrative practices and legal procedures that proved more effective than their continental counterparts. The resulting hybrid system combined Norman organization with English expertise, creating something that was neither purely foreign nor entirely native. William's success in imposing Norman rule on England was remarkable for its thoroughness and permanence. Unlike many medieval conquests that remained superficial impositions on resistant populations, the Norman transformation of England fundamentally altered the character of the kingdom. The changes introduced by William would shape English development for centuries to come. By the end of William's reign, England had become a Norman kingdom in all but name. The language of government was French, the law was continental, the nobility was foreign, and the culture was increasingly influenced by continental models. Yet, paradoxically, this foreign conquest would eventually create a uniquely English identity that combined the best elements of both traditions. The iron fist of Norman rule had reshaped England more thoroughly than any previous conquest. William had achieved something that neither Roman legions nor Viking raiders had accomplished: the complete transformation of English society according to foreign models. His success lay not merely in military conquest, but in the systematic replacement of English institutions with Norman alternatives that proved more durable and effective. As England entered the final decades of the 11th century, it was a kingdom transformed. The Anglo-Saxon past had become a foreign country, while the Norman present promised a future that would be dramatically different from anything the English had previously known. William's conquest had indeed built a new England, but it was an England constructed on the foundations of blood, iron, and unrelenting royal authority. By the winter of 1085, William had ruled England for nearly 20 years, transforming a conquered territory into one of medieval Europe's most efficiently administered kingdoms. His Norman nobles had established themselves across the land. His castles dominated every strategic point, and his authority was undisputed from the Scottish borders to the English Channel. Yet the aging king faced new challenges that would require unprecedented knowledge of his realm's resources and capabilities. The threat came from an unexpected quarter: Denmark, whose kings had never fully abandoned their ancestral claims to the English throne. King Knut IV of Denmark, grandson of the earlier Danish king who had ruled England, was assembling a massive invasion fleet that threatened to undo everything William had accomplished. Intelligence reports spoke of hundreds of ships and thousands of warriors preparing to cross the North Sea in the spring of 1086, promising the most serious external threat to Norman rule since the conquest itself. This Danish menace forced William to confront a fundamental problem that had plagued medieval rulers for centuries: the lack of reliable information about their own kingdoms. How many knights could each manor support? What revenues could be extracted from various estates? Which lands were most productive, and which lay waste? These questions had no clear answers, yet they were crucial for organizing effective defense against invasion. Medieval administration had traditionally relied on rough estimates, local knowledge, and approximate calculations that were adequate for routine governance, but insufficient for the extraordinary demands of major military campaigns. William needed precise information about England's resources if he was to raise the armies and revenues necessary to defeat a Danish invasion that might be supported by internal English rebellions. The king's solution was characteristically thorough and systematic. In December 1085, during the Great Christmas Court at Gloucester, William announced his intention to conduct a comprehensive survey of every landholding in England. This would be no casual census, but a detailed investigation into the ownership, value, and productivity of every manor, village, and estate in the kingdom. The scope of the proposed survey was breathtaking in its ambition. Royal commissioners would visit every shire in England, examining not only current landholdings, but also their status before the conquest, allowing comparison between Anglo-Saxon and Norman administration. Every piece of arable land would be measured, every mill and church recorded, every peasant and livestock counted with mathematical precision. The announcement sent shockwaves through Norman England, as nobles and officials contemplated the massive undertaking that the king had commanded. Nothing on this scale had ever been attempted in medieval Europe. The administrative challenge was comparable to conducting a modern national census with 11th century technology and transportation. Yet William's determination brooked no opposition, and preparations began immediately. The kingdom was divided into circuits, each assigned to a team of royal commissioners drawn from the highest ranks of Norman nobility and clergy. These men carried the full authority of the crown, empowered to compel testimony from anyone regardless of social rank. Their investigations would be thorough, systematic, and utterly comprehensive, leaving no stone unturned in the quest for complete knowledge. The methodology developed for the survey demonstrated the sophisticated administrative capabilities that Norman rule had brought to England. A standardized questionnaire was prepared, ensuring that identical information would be collected from every location. The questions were precise and practical, focusing on the data that royal administrators needed for taxation and military assessment. Each manor was to be examined according to a fixed formula. What was the name of the holding? Who held it in the time of King Edward? Who holds it now? How many hides of land does it contain? How many ploughs are there? How many villagers, cottagers, and slaves? How many mills and churches? What is the total value, both before the conquest and at the present time? The commissioners arrived in each shire with impressive retinues that demonstrated royal power and authority. Local officials were required to assemble juries of both Norman and English landholders who could provide accurate information about current conditions and pre-conquest arrangements. These mixed juries ensured that the survey would capture perspectives from both sides of the social divide created by the conquest. The process of data collection required months of intensive work, as commissioners travelled from manor to manor, village to village, conducting detailed interviews and examinations. Local knowledge had to be tested against neighbouring testimony, while disputes over boundaries and ownership required careful investigation. The commissioners had authority to resolve disagreements on the spot, making decisions that would be recorded as permanent royal judgments. The survey revealed the extraordinary transformation that Norman rule had brought to England. The wholesale transfer of land from English to Norman hands was documented with mathematical precision. Statistics that demonstrated how completely the old ruling class had been replaced. Less than 5% of English land remained in Anglo-Saxon hands, a figure that starkly illustrated the thoroughness of William's conquest. Regional variations in the impact of conquest became clear as the survey progressed. Southern counties that had submitted early showed less disruption than northern areas that had resisted Norman rule. The devastation caused by the harrying of the north was starkly evident in the Yorkshire entries, where vast areas were still recorded as waste nearly 20 years after William's punitive campaign. The economic data collected by the survey provided William with unprecedented insights into the productivity and potential of his kingdom. England proved to be far wealthier than many had realized, with agricultural resources that could support much larger military forces than had been previously imagined. The king now possessed the knowledge necessary to extract maximum resources for defense against Danish invasion. But the survey served purposes beyond immediate military necessity. The detailed records of landholding and taxation created a permanent framework for royal administration that would outlast any particular crisis. Future kings would be able to refer to this comprehensive record when making decisions about taxation, military service, and land grants, creating continuity and efficiency that had been impossible under previous systems. The work of compilation required extraordinary organizational skills, as thousands of individual manor records were consolidated into county summaries and then into the final volumes. Scribes working under royal supervision created standardized entries that reduced complex local arrangements to consistent formulas. The result was a masterpiece of medieval administration that demonstrated the sophistication of Norman governmental methods. Two great volumes emerged from this massive undertaking. Great Domesday covered most of England with summary records organized by county and landholder. Little Domesday contained the full, unabbreviated returns for Essex, Norfolk, and Suffolk, providing a glimpse of the complete detail that had been collected for every area of England. The survey's completion in 1086 gave William knowledge of his kingdom that no previous English ruler had possessed. The king could now calculate with precision the military service owed by each landholder, the revenues available from royal estates, and the resources that could be mobilized in times of emergency. England had become the most thoroughly documented kingdom in medieval Europe. The name Domesday Book was applied to the survey within a generation of its completion, reflecting popular perception of its comprehensive and final character. Like the Last Judgment itself, the Royal Survey had examined every detail of human activity and recorded it for all time. No appeal was possible from its judgments. No revision would be permitted of its conclusions. The Danish invasion that had prompted the survey never materialized, as King Canute IV was murdered before his fleet could sail for England. But the administrative achievement remained as a permanent monument to Norman efficiency and royal authority. The survey had demonstrated that William's government could accomplish tasks that would have been unthinkable under previous English rulers. The long-term significance of the Domesday Survey extended far beyond its immediate military purposes. The detailed record of English society in 1086 provided a baseline for understanding social and economic development that would prove invaluable to historians and administrators for centuries to come. Medieval England had been captured in statistical amber, preserved for all time in the pages of the Great Survey. The project also demonstrated the remarkable administrative capabilities that Norman rule had brought to England. The ability to organize and complete such a massive undertaking required governmental machinery of unprecedented sophistication and efficiency. William had created an administrative state that could gather, process, and utilize information on a scale that amazed contemporaries and impressed later generations. As the Great Survey neared completion, William could survey his achievements with justified satisfaction. He had transformed a conquered territory into a thoroughly documented and efficiently administered kingdom. The Domesday Book represented the culmination of his efforts to impose Norman order on English chaos, creating a system of government that would endure long after its creator's death. The survey also marked the end of an era in English history. The detailed record of landholding in 1086 captured the moment when the Norman transformation of England was essentially complete. The old Anglo-Saxon world had been systematically replaced by Norman institutions, and the Great Survey documented this revolutionary change with mathematical precision. William's masterpiece of administration would outlive him by centuries, serving as the foundation for English government long after the Norman dynasty had passed away. The aging king who had begun his reign as William the Bastard could now call himself the creator of modern English administration, the ruler who had brought unprecedented order and efficiency to a conquered kingdom. But time was running short for the great conqueror. Even as his clerks put the finishing touches on the Domesday Survey, William was aging rapidly and facing new challenges that would test his strength for the final time. The survey would be his last great achievement, a fitting monument to a reign that had transformed England more thoroughly than any ruler before or since. The year 1087 found William of Normandy in the twilight of his remarkable life, his body bearing the accumulated weight of 60 years that had been filled with constant warfare, political struggle, and the immense burden of ruling two realms, separated by treacherous waters. The lean, athletic warrior, who had charged up the slopes at Hastings 21 years earlier, had become a corpulent, grey-bearded king whose once fearsome presence was diminished by age and the physical toll of his extraordinary career. The great conqueror's final years had been marked by mounting frustrations and bitter family conflicts that soured what should have been his triumph in old age. His eldest son, Robert Curthose, had proven to be everything that William was not: indecisive, weak-willed, and more interested in courtly pleasures than the hard work of government. The young man who would inherit Normandy had repeatedly defied his father's authority, even going so far as to ally himself with William's enemies in France. The conflict between father and son had reached its nadir in 1079 when Robert actually took up arms against William in open rebellion. The battle that followed was small in scale, but enormous in its psychological impact. For the first time in his career, William suffered defeat in personal combat when his own son wounded him and forced him to retreat from the field. The humiliation was compounded by the knowledge that his designated heir was both capable of violence against him and popular with Norman nobles who chafed under royal authority. These family troubles were exacerbated by the growing hostility of Philip I, King of France, who had once been William's ally, but now saw the powerful Duke of Normandy as a threat to French royal authority. Philip's strategy was to encourage discord within the Norman realm, while gradually nibbling away at its borders through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic manipulation. The French king understood that a strong, unified Normandy posed an existential threat to his own kingdom's security. The immediate cause of William's final campaign arose from Philip's decision to seize the Norman border town of Mantes in the spring of 1087. This aggression was accompanied by personal insults that struck directly at William's pride and dignity. According to the chroniclers, Philip mocked the aging Norman king's obesity, suggesting that he spent his time lying in bed like a woman in childbirth, rather than defending his territories like a proper warrior. Such insults could not be ignored by a ruler whose authority rested largely on his reputation for military prowess and personal courage. Medieval kingship was intensely personal, and a monarch who allowed himself to be mocked without response would soon find his enemies emboldened and his supporters demoralized. Despite his age and poor health, William felt compelled to prove that the conqueror of England was still capable of bringing fire and sword to his enemies. The decision to campaign personally against Mantes was controversial, even among William's closest advisors. Many urged the 60-year-old king to send younger commanders while he remained safely in Rouen, directing strategy from his palace, rather than risking his life in what was essentially a punitive expedition. But William's pride would not permit such caution. He would lead his forces personally or not at all. The army that assembled for the Mantes campaign was formidable, but far smaller than the great host that William had commanded in his prime. Norman military strength had been dispersed across two kingdoms and was no longer concentrated in the duchy as it had been during the heroic days of the conquest. Nevertheless, the force that marched from Rouen in July 1087 was more than adequate for reducing a single French town to submission. The siege of Mantes proceeded according to time-honoured medieval conventions, with Norman forces surrounding the town and systematically destroying its defences. The defenders, knowing that they faced the wrath of one of Europe's most dangerous rulers, offered determined resistance that prolonged the siege for several weeks. But the outcome was never seriously in doubt. William's veterans possessed too much experience and equipment for the French garrison to resist indefinitely. The final assault on Mantes began at dawn on a sweltering summer morning, with Norman troops scaling the walls, while engineers used fire arrows to ignite buildings within the town. The attack succeeded brilliantly, and by noon the defenders were fleeing through the gates while Norman soldiers poured into the streets. What followed was the systematic destruction that had become William's signature response to defiance. The burning of Mantes was thorough and merciless, reflecting the aging king's determination to send an unmistakable message to Philip I and any other French nobles who might contemplate challenging Norman authority. Churches were not spared despite their sacred character, as William's forces put the torch to everything that would burn. The town that had been prosperous and thriving in the morning was reduced to smouldering ruins by evening. William himself rode through the burning streets to survey the destruction his orders had wrought, his face set in the grim expression that had terrified enemies for decades. Despite his age and physical condition, the king insisted on seeing personally that his commands were being executed properly. It was this attention to detail, this refusal to delegate authority even in minor matters, that had made him such a formidable ruler throughout his career. But as William's horse picked its way through the rubble-strewn streets of burning Mantes, disaster struck with the sudden violence that characterizes so many crucial moments in history. The destrier, perhaps frightened by falling timbers or startled by the roar of flames, stepped on a piece of burning wood that had fallen from a collapsing building. The horse reared in pain and terror, throwing its rider forward against the high pommel of his saddle with tremendous force. The impact drove the iron pommel deep into William's abdomen, rupturing internal organs and causing injuries that medieval medicine was powerless to treat effectively. The man, who had survived countless battles and assassination attempts, was brought low by a riding accident during what should have been a routine inspection of conquered territory. The irony was not lost on contemporaries who saw divine judgment in the manner of the great conqueror's downfall. William's companions immediately recognized the severity of his injuries and arranged for his transport back to Rouen, where the royal physicians could examine him more thoroughly. The journey was agonizing for the wounded king, as every movement of the litter caused excruciating pain from his damaged internal organs. By the time he reached his capital, it was clear that his injuries were beyond the healing power of 11th century medical knowledge. The royal apartments at Rouen became a deathbed chamber as William lay in increasing agony while internal bleeding and infection slowly destroyed his once powerful body. The king, who had commanded armies and conquered kingdoms, was reduced to helpless dependence on servants and physicians who could do little except provide comfort during his final ordeal. The transformation from mighty ruler to dying invalid was swift and shocking. As news of William's condition spread, the political implications became clear to everyone involved. The succession arrangements that had seemed adequate during times of health and strength now appeared dangerously uncertain. Robert Curthose was still in rebellion, allied with the French king, and commanding significant support among Norman nobles. William Rufus was loyal but untested, while Henry was too young to be considered a serious candidate for immediate succession. The dying king spent his final weeks attempting to resolve the succession crisis and prepare his realms for the transition to new leadership. Despite their bitter conflicts, he confirmed Robert as heir to Normandy, while designating William Rufus to inherit England. Henry received a substantial monetary inheritance that would allow him to purchase lands and build his own power base. These arrangements reflected William's understanding that his domains were too large and diverse to be governed effectively by a single ruler. The deathbed reconciliation between William and Robert provided some comfort to the dying king, though it came too late to heal the deep wounds that years of conflict had created. The elder son's submission allowed William to believe that the Norman succession would proceed smoothly, though events would soon prove this optimism misplaced. Medieval family relationships were notoriously unstable, especially when vast inheritances were at stake. As September 1087 progressed, William's condition steadily deteriorated despite the best efforts of his physicians and the prayers of clergy, who maintained constant vigil beside his bed. The robust constitution that had sustained him through decades of warfare was finally failing. Worn down by a lifetime of physical stress and the complications arising from his recent injuries, the end was approaching, and everyone in the royal household knew it. The final campaign had ended not in triumph, but in personal disaster for the great conqueror. The man who had built his reputation on never accepting defeat had been defeated by a frightened horse and a piece of burning timber. Yet even in his final agony, William demonstrated the strength of character that had carried him from bastard duke to conqueror king, facing death with the same grim determination that had marked his entire remarkable career. As the summer of 1087 drew toward its close, William prepared for his greatest and final journey, not to another battlefield or political negotiation, but to whatever judgment awaited beyond the veil of death. The conqueror, who had reshaped England and Normandy through force of will, was about to discover whether his earthly achievements would count for anything in the eternal realm that awaited all medieval men and women, regardless of their temporal power and glory. The dawn of September 9th, 1087, broke grey and mournful over the priory of Saint-Gervais near Rouen, where William the Conqueror lay dying in circumstances that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The man who had commanded the loyalty of thousands, who had conquered kingdoms and built a legacy that stretched across 2 realms, now found himself abandoned by all but a few faithful servants, as his great nobles fled to secure their own positions in the chaos that would inevitably follow his death. William's final hours were marked by the kind of political calculation that had characterized his entire reign, even as his body was racked with pain from the internal injuries that were slowly killing him. Despite the agony that made every breath a struggle, the dying king forced himself to address the crucial matter of succession, knowing that his death would unleash forces that could destroy everything he had built over more than 50 years of rule. The scene in the death chamber was both pathetic and dignified, as the once mighty conqueror struggled to maintain royal authority even while his physical strength ebbed away. Bishops and abbots surrounded his bed, offering prayers and spiritual comfort, while his few remaining loyal supporters waited anxiously for his final commands. The political implications of every word were enormous, as these would be the statements that determined the future of Normandy and England. In a voice weakened by pain, but still carrying the authority that had once commanded armies, William formally confirmed the succession arrangements he had decided upon during his final weeks. Robert Curthose, despite their bitter conflicts, would inherit the Duchy of Normandy as the eldest son and traditional heir. William Rufus would receive the crown of England, a realm that required strong leadership and ruthless determination to maintain Norman control over a still restive population. The dying king's disposal of his youngest son, Henry's inheritance, revealed both pragmatic calculation and paternal affection. Rather than granting him lands that might become sources of conflict with his brothers, William bequeathed Henry £5,000 of silver, an enormous sum that would allow him to purchase his own territories and build an independent power base. This arrangement demonstrated William's understanding that his domains were too large and diverse to remain unified under weak leadership. As his strength faded, William attempted to address the spiritual reckoning that medieval Christianity taught awaited every soul after death. The conqueror, who had built his power through violence and intimidation, now sought to balance the scales of divine justice through deathbed charity and confessions of guilt. He ordered that his personal treasure be distributed to churches and monasteries, hoping that good works might outweigh the sins of his earthly career. The king's confessions revealed the psychological burden that his harsh methods had imposed even upon their author. He spoke with particular remorse about the harrying of the north, acknowledging that his systematic devastation of Yorkshire had caused suffering that went far beyond military necessity. The man who had shown no mercy to his enemies while living now begged for mercy from the divine judge who would soon pass sentence on his soul. But even as William prepared his soul for judgment, the practical realities of medieval politics intruded upon his deathbed scene. News arrived that his half-brother Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, had been released from prison, where he had been held for treason against royal authority. The dying king's decision to free this dangerous relative reflected both Christian forgiveness and practical recognition that continuing the imprisonment would serve no useful purpose after his death. William's final moments came in the early morning hours of September 9th, as the first light of dawn filtered through the windows of the priory chamber. The great conqueror's death was quiet and dignified, a stark contrast to the violent and dramatic nature of his life. With his last breath, he commended his soul to God and his realms to his chosen successors, trusting that they would prove worthy of the inheritance he was leaving them. But the dignity of William's death was immediately shattered by the chaos that erupted in its aftermath. The great nobles and royal officials who had maintained careful vigils while the king lived suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere once they were certain he was dead. The prospect of rich pickings in the inevitable succession struggles that would follow outweighed any sentimental attachment to their deceased master's remains. The abandonment of William's corpse was swift and complete. Within hours of his death, the royal apartments were stripped of everything valuable by servants and minor officials, who recognized that this might be their only opportunity for significant profit. Gold and silver plate, rich tapestries, weapons, and even the dying king's personal clothing were carried off by anyone with access to the death chamber. The conqueror, who had accumulated vast wealth, was left literally naked on his deathbed. The scene that greeted those who eventually returned to deal with William's remains was shocking even by medieval standards. The man who had been one of Europe's most powerful rulers lay abandoned like a common pauper, his body already beginning to show signs of decomposition in the warm September weather. The contrast between his earthly glory and posthumous humiliation would have provided medieval moralists with perfect material for sermons about the vanity of worldly ambition. Eventually, a minor knight named Herluin took pity on the abandoned corpse and arranged for basic preparations for burial. This act of charity was remarkable, not for its generosity, but for its rarity. Apparently no one else was willing to take responsibility for the practical arrangements surrounding William's funeral. The man who had commanded the loyalty of thousands died friendless and forgotten by all but the humblest of his former subjects. The transport of William's body to Caen, where he had requested burial in his foundation of Saint-Étienne, became another source of humiliation for the dead king's memory. The corpse had to be carried by hired bearers rather than noble pallbearers, and the journey was delayed by practical difficulties that would never have occurred during William's lifetime. Even in death, the conqueror was learning that royal authority was a fragile thing that evaporated quickly once its source was gone. The situation at Caen provided yet another demonstration of how quickly William's authority had collapsed. When the funeral procession arrived at the abbey church, they found the town in flames from a fire that had broken out just as the ceremony was beginning. The monks who should have been conducting funeral rites were instead fighting to save their buildings, leaving William's corpse to wait while more pressing concerns were addressed. The funeral service, when it finally began, was disrupted by an extraordinary scene that highlighted the controversial nature of William's entire career. As the Bishop of Évreux delivered a eulogy praising the dead king's achievements, a local knight named Asselin rose from the congregation to voice a stunning accusation. The land on which the abbey stood, he declared, had been stolen from his family by William years earlier, and he forbade the burial of the despoiler in soil that rightfully belonged to him. The accusation created chaos in the church, as the assembled clergy and nobles realized that the man's claim was probably valid. William's foundation of Saint-Étienne had indeed been built on confiscated land, and the original owner's family had never been compensated for their loss. Medieval law was clear on such matters. Property rights were sacred, and even a king's burial could not proceed on stolen ground without the rightful owner's consent. Frantic negotiations ensued as William's supporters attempted to resolve the crisis without further delay or embarrassment. Asselin was eventually persuaded to allow the burial in exchange for immediate payment of 60 shillings and a promise of additional compensation later. The humiliating spectacle of haggling over the price of a burial plot for one of Europe's greatest kings provided a fitting commentary on the ultimate futility of earthly power and ambition. But the worst humiliation was yet to come. When the funeral party attempted to lower William's corpse into the stone sarcophagus that had been prepared for it, they discovered that the tomb was too small to accommodate the king's body. Years of comfortable living had expanded William's girth considerably, and the tomb makers had apparently based their measurements on memories of the lean warrior, rather than the corpulent reality of his final years. The attempts to force the body into the undersized tomb resulted in a grotesque accident that horrified everyone present. The pressure required to compress the corpse into the available space caused William's abdomen to burst, releasing a stench so overwhelming that the entire congregation fled from the church in panic. The conqueror, who had terrorized his enemies in life, succeeded in routing even his friends and supporters in death. The explosion of William's corpse was interpreted by many as divine judgment on a king whose methods had often been brutal and whose conscience was burdened with many sins. Medieval minds were quick to see symbolic meaning in such events, and the spectacular failure of William's burial arrangements seemed to confirm that God had found his earthly career wanting. The man who had claimed divine approval for his conquest of England was apparently being denied peaceful rest, even in death. The funeral that was finally completed after these multiple disasters bore little resemblance to the dignified ceremony that should have marked the passing of such a significant ruler. Instead of the solemn majesty appropriate for a king's burial, William's funeral became a farce that would be remembered more for its failures than for any honour it showed to the deceased. The conqueror's final public appearance was as a source of chaos and humiliation, rather than respect and mourning. In the aftermath of these events, attempts were made to restore some dignity to William's memory through the construction of a proper tomb and the establishment of prayers for his soul. A simple marble slab was placed over his grave with a Latin inscription acknowledging his achievements. though even this monument would be disturbed and destroyed multiple times in later centuries. The man who had built his legacy in stone and steel found that even his tomb could not provide lasting security. The contrast between William's earthly power and his posthumous humiliation provided medieval chroniclers with a powerful reminder of mortality's ultimate victory over even the mightiest rulers. The king, who had commanded armies and conquered kingdoms, was reduced to an object of ridicule and disgust, his final moments serving as a cautionary tale about the vanity of worldly ambition. Death, it seemed, was the only conqueror that could never be defeated. As news of William's death and the circumstances surrounding his burial spread across his former domains, they marked the end of an era in European history. The man who had transformed England and dominated northern France for a generation was gone, leaving behind a legacy that was as controversial as it was significant. The conqueror, who had built his kingdom on blood, had discovered that even kings must eventually face judgment, and that earthly glory provides no protection against the final humiliation of death. The disgraceful end of William the Conqueror served as a fitting conclusion to a life that had been marked by both extraordinary achievement and terrible brutality. The man who had shown no mercy to his enemies received little mercy from fate, while the king, who had built his power through fear and intimidation, found that death could inspire neither fear nor respect. In the end, the mighty conqueror was conquered by the one enemy that no amount of military skill or political cunning could defeat. And so ends the remarkable tale of William the Conqueror, the bastard duke who became the architect of medieval England through blood, iron, and unshakable determination. From his illegitimate birth in the stone walls of Falaise Castle to his humiliating death and burial at Caen, William's life was a testament to both the possibilities and the costs of unbridled ambition in the medieval world. His legacy stretches far beyond the Norman Conquest itself, reaching into the very foundations of English law, language, culture, and government that would shape the nation for centuries to come. The feudal system he imposed, the castles he built, the administrative innovations he introduced, and the cultural transformation he orchestrated created an England that was fundamentally different from the Anglo-Saxon kingdom he had conquered in 1066. Yet this transformation came at a terrible human cost that William himself acknowledged on his deathbed: the harrying of the north, the wholesale replacement of English nobility, the suppression of native customs and language. All of these represented a systematic destruction of an ancient civilization that had flourished in Britain for over 6 centuries. The conqueror who built so much also destroyed so much, leaving a complex legacy that historians continue to debate nearly 1,000 years later. Perhaps most remarkably, William succeeded in creating institutions and traditions that outlasted not only his own life, but the entire Norman dynasty that followed him. The England that emerged from his conquest would go on to become one of history's most influential nations, spreading its language, laws, and customs across the globe through an empire that William himself could never have imagined. As you drift gently towards sleep, let the echoes of this extraordinary life remind you of the complex nature of historical achievement, how great accomplishments often come at great cost, how individual ambition can reshape entire civilizations, and how even the mightiest conquerors must eventually face the one enemy that no earthly power can defeat. Thank you for joining me on this long journey through the life of William the Conqueror. If you've enjoyed this extended exploration of medieval history, a gentle like would mean the world to me. And please don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments below. Even our quiet listeners are always welcome to say hello. Subscribe to Sleepy Crown for more soothing historical tales that will carry you peacefully into dreamland. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be more peaceful than that of the restless conqueror whose story we've shared tonight.